Chapter 94. Maximilian's avowal. At the same moment M. de Villefort's voice was heard calling from his study. "What is the matter?" Morrel looked at Noirtier, who had recovered his self-command, and with a glance indicated the closet where once before, under somewhat similar circumstances, he had taken refuge. He had only time to get his hat and throw himself breathless into the closet when the procureur's footstep was heard in the passage. Villefort sprang into the room, ran to Valentine, and took her in his arms. A physician, M. d'Avrigny," cried Villefort. "Or rather I will go for him myself." He flew from the apartment, and Morrel at the same moment darted out at the other door. He had been struck to the heart by a frightful recollection. The conversation he had heard between the doctor and Villefort the night of Madame de Saint-Méran's death recurred to him. These symptoms, to a less alarming extent, were the same which had preceded the death of Berois. At the same time, Monte Cristo's voice seemed to resound in his ear with the words he had heard only 2 hours before. "Whatever you want, Morrel, come to me. I have great power." More rapidly than thought, he darted down the Rue Matignon, and thence to the Avenue de Champs-Élysées. Meanwhile M. de Villefort arrived in a hired cabriolet at M. d'Avrigny's door. He rang so violently that the porter was alarmed. Villefort ran upstairs without saying a word. The porter knew him and let him pass, only calling to him, "In his study, Monsieur Procureur, in his study." Villefort pushed, or rather forced, the door open. "Ah," said the doctor. "Is it you?" "Yes," said Villefort, closing the door after him. "It is I, who am come in my turn to ask you if we are quite alone." "Doctor, my house is accursed." "What?" said the latter with apparent coolness, but with deep emotion. "Have you another invalid?" "Yes, doctor," cried Villefort, clutching his hair. "Yes," d'Avrigny's look implied. "I told you it would be so." Then he slowly uttered these words. "Who is now dying in your house? What new victim is going to accuse you of weakness before God?" A mournful sob burst from Villefort's heart. He approached the doctor, and seizing his arm, "Valentine," said he. "It is Valentine's turn." "Your daughter!" cried d'Avrigny with grief and surprise. "You see you were deceived," murmured the magistrate. "Come and see her, and on her bed of agony entreat her pardon for having suspected her." "Each time you have applied to me," said the doctor, "it has been too late. Still I will go. But let us make haste, sir. With the enemies you have to do with there is no time to be lost." "Oh, this time, doctor, you shall not have to reproach me with weakness. This time I will know the assassin, and will pursue him. Let us try first to save the victim before we think of revenging her," said d'Avrigny. "Come." The same cabriolet which had brought Villefort took them back at full speed, and at this moment Morrel rapped at Monte Cristo's door. The Count was in his study and was reading with an angry look something which Bertuccio had brought in haste. Hearing the name of Morrel, who had left him only 2 hours before, the Count raised his head, arose, and sprang to meet him. "What is the matter, Maximilian?" asked he. "You are pale, and the perspiration rolls from your forehead." Morrel fell into a chair. "Yes," said he. "I came quickly. I wanted to speak to you." "Are all your family well?" asked the Count, with an affectionate benevolence, whose sincerity no one could for a moment doubt. "Thank you, Count, thank you," said the young man, evidently embarrassed how to begin the conversation. "Yes, everyone in my family is well. So much the better. Yet you have something to tell me?" replied the Count with increased anxiety. "Yes," said Morrel. "It is true. I have but now left a house where death has just entered to run to you." "Are you then come from M. de Morcerf's?" asked Monte Cristo. "No," said Morrel. "Is someone dead in his house?" "The general has just blown his brains out," replied Monte Cristo with great coolness. "Oh, what a dreadful event!" cried Maximilian. "Not for the Countess or for Albert," said Monte Cristo. "A dead father or husband is better than a dishonored one. Blood washes out shame." "Poor Countess," said Maximilian. "I pity her very much. She is so noble a woman." "Pity Albert also, Maximilian. For believe me, he is the worthy son of the Countess. But let us return to yourself. You have hastened to me. Can I have the happiness of being useful to you?" Yes, I need your help. That is, I thought like a madman that you could lend me your assistance in a case where God alone can succor me. Tell me what it is, replied Monte Cristo. Oh, said Morrel, I know not, indeed, if I may reveal this secret to mortal ears, but fatality impels me, necessity constrains me, Count. Morrel hesitated. Do you think I love you? Said Monte Cristo, taking the young man's hand affectionately in his. Oh, you encourage me, and something tells me there, placing his hand on his heart, that I ought to have no secret from you. You are right, Morrel. God is speaking to your heart, and your heart speaks to you. Tell me what it says. Count, will you allow me to send Baptistin to inquire after someone you know? I am at your service, and still more my servants. Oh, I cannot live if she is not better. Shall I ring for Baptistin? No, I will go and speak to him myself. Morrel went out, called Baptistin, and whispered a few words to him. The valet ran directly. Well, have you sent? Asked Monte Cristo, seeing Morrel return. Yes, and now I shall be more calm. You know I am waiting, said Monte Cristo, smiling. Yes, and I will tell you. One evening I was in a garden. A clump of trees concealed me. No one suspected I was there. Two persons passed near me. Allow me to conceal their names for the present. They were speaking in an undertone, and yet I was so interested in what they said that I did not lose a single word. This is a gloomy introduction, if I may judge from your pallor and shuddering, Morrel. Oh yes, very gloomy, my friend. Someone had just died in the house to which that garden belonged. One of the persons whose conversation I overheard was the master of the house. The other, the physician. The former was confiding to the latter his grief and fear, for it was the second time within a month that death had suddenly and unexpectedly entered that house, which was apparently destined to destruction by some exterminating angel, as an object of God's anger. Ah, indeed, said Monte Cristo, looking earnestly at the young man, and by an imperceptible movement turning his chair, so that he remained in the shade while the light fell full on Maximilian's face. Yes, continued Morrel, death had entered that house twice within 1 month. And what did the doctor answer? Asked Monte Cristo. He replied, that the death was not a natural one, and must be attributed to what? To poison. Indeed, said Monte Cristo with a slight cough which in moments of extreme emotion helped him to disguise a blush, or his pallor, or the intense interest with which he listened. Indeed, Maximilian, did you hear that? Yes, my dear Count, I heard it. And the doctor added that if another death occurred in a similar way he must appeal to justice. Monte Cristo listened, or appeared to do so, with the greatest calmness. Well, said Maximilian. Death came a third time, and neither the master of the house nor the doctor said a word. Death is now, perhaps, striking a fourth blow. Count, what am I bound to do, being in possession of this secret? My dear friend, said Monte Cristo, you appear to be relating an adventure which we all know by heart. I know the house where you heard it, or one very similar to it. A house with a garden, a master, a physician, and where there have been 3 unexpected and sudden deaths. Well, I have not intercepted your confidence, and yet I know all that as well as you, and I have no conscientious scruples. No, it does not concern me. You say an exterminating angel appears to have devoted that house to God's anger. Well, who says your supposition is not reality? Do not notice things which those whose interest it is to see them pass over. If it is God's justice, instead of his anger, which is walking through that house, Maximilian, turn away your face and let his justice accomplish its purpose. Morrel shuddered. There was something mournful, solemn, and terrible in the Count's manner. Besides, continued he, in so changed a tone that no one would have supposed it was the same person speaking. Besides, who says that it will begin again? It has returned, Count, exclaimed Morrel. That is why I hastened to you. Well, what do you wish me to do? Do you wish me, for instance, to give information to the procureur? Monte Cristo uttered the last words with so much meaning that Morrel, starting up, cried out, You know of whom I speak, Count, do you not? Perfectly well, my good friend, and I will prove it to you by putting the dots to the I, or rather by naming the persons. You were walking one evening in M. de Villefort's garden. From what you relate, I suppose it to have been the evening of Madame de Saint-Méran's death. You heard M. de Villefort talking to M. d'Avrigny about the death of M. de Saint-Méran, and that no less surprising of the Countess. M. d'Avrigny said he believed they both proceeded from poison, and you, honest man, have ever since been asking your heart and sounding your conscience to know if you ought to expose or conceal this secret. We are no longer in the Middle Ages. There is no longer a Vemgericht or free tribunals. What do you want to ask these people? Conscience, what hast thou to do with me? As Sterne said, my dear fellow, let them sleep on if they are asleep. Let them grow pale in their drowsiness, if they are disposed to do so, and pray do you remain in peace, who have no remorse to disturb you. Deep grief was depicted on Morel's features. He seized Monte Cristo's hand. But it is beginning again, I say. Well, said the Count, astonished at his perseverance, which he could not understand, and looking still more earnestly at Maximilian. Let it begin again. It is like the house of the Atridae wink with a frown. 19 God has condemned them, and they must submit to their punishment. They will all disappear, like the fabrics children build with cards, and which fall, one by one, under the breath of their builder, even if there are 200 of them. 3 months since it was M. de Saint-Méran. Madame de Saint-Méran 2 months since. The other day it was Berois. Today the old Noirtier or young Valentine. You knew it? Cried Morel, in such a paroxysm of terror that Monte Cristo started. He whom the falling heavens would have found unmoved. You knew it and said nothing? And what is it to me? Replied Monte Cristo, shrugging his shoulders. Do I know those people? And must I lose the one to save the other? Faith, no, for between the culprit and the victim I have no choice. But I, cried Morel, groaning with sorrow, I love her. You love? Whom? Cried Monte Cristo, starting to his feet, and seizing the 2 hands which Morel was raising towards heaven. I love most fondly, I love madly. I love as a man who would give his lifeblood to spare her a tear. I love Valentine de Villefort, who is being murdered at this moment. Do you understand me? I love her. And I ask God and you how I can save her. Monte Cristo uttered a cry which those only can conceive who have heard the roar of a wounded lion. Unhappy man, cried he, wringing his hands in his turn. You love Valentine, that daughter of an accursed race. Never had Morel witnessed such an expression. Never had so terrible an eye flashed before his face. Never had the genius of terror he had so often seen, either on the battlefield or in the murderous nights of Algeria, shaken around him more dreadful fire. He drew back terrified. As for Monte Cristo, after this ebullition he closed his eyes as if dazzled by internal light. In a moment he restrained himself so powerfully that the tempestuous heaving of his breast subsided, as turbulent and foaming waves yield to the sun's genial influence when the cloud has passed. This silence, self-control, and struggle lasted about 20 seconds. Then the Count raised his pallid face. See, said he, my dear friend, how God punishes the most thoughtless and unfeeling men for their indifference, by presenting dreadful scenes to their view. I, who was looking on, an eager and curious spectator. I, who was watching the working of this mournful tragedy. I, who like a wicked angel was laughing at the evil men committed protected by secrecy. A secret is easily kept by the rich and powerful. I am in my turn bitten by the serpent whose tortuous course I was watching, and bitten to the heart. Morel groaned. Come, come, continued the Count. Complaints are unavailing. Be a man, be strong, be full of hope, for I am here and will watch over you. Morel shook his head sorrowfully. I tell you to hope. Do you understand me? Cried Monte Cristo. Remember that I never uttered a falsehood and am never deceived. It is 12 o'clock, Maximilian. Thank heaven that you came at noon rather than in the evening, or tomorrow morning. Listen, Morel, it is noon. If Valentine is not now dead, she will not die. How so? Cried Morel. When I left her dying? Monte Cristo pressed his hands to his forehead. What was passing in that brain, so loaded with dreadful secrets? What does the angel of light or the angel of darkness say to that mind, at once implacable and generous? God only knows. Monte Cristo raised his head once more, and this time he was calm as a child awaking from its sleep. "Maximilian," said he, "return home. I command you not to stir. Attempt nothing, not to let your countenance betray a thought, and I will send you tidings. Go." "Oh, Count, you overwhelm me with that coolness. Have you, then, power against death? Are you superhuman? Are you an angel?" And the young man, who had never shrunk from danger, shrank before Monte Cristo with indescribable terror. But Monte Cristo looked at him with so melancholy and sweet a smile that Maximilian felt the tears filling his eyes. "I can do much for you, my friend," replied the Count. "Go, I must be alone." Moral: subdued by the extraordinary ascendancy Monte Cristo exercised over everything around him, did not endeavor to resist it. He pressed the Count's hand and left. He stopped one moment at the door for Baptistin, whom he saw in the Rue Matignon, and who was running meanwhile. Villefort and d'Avrigny had made all possible haste. Valentine had not revived from her fainting fit on their arrival, and the doctor examined the invalid with all the care the circumstances demanded, and with an interest which the knowledge of the secret intensified twofold. Villefort, closely watching his countenance and his lips, awaited the result of the examination. Noirtier, paler than even the young girl, more eager than Villefort for the decision, was watching also intently and affectionately. At last d'Avrigny slowly uttered these words. "She is still alive." "Still!" cried Villefort. "Oh, doctor, what a dreadful word is that!" "Yes," said the physician. "I repeat it. She is still alive, and I am astonished at it." "But is she safe?" asked the father. "Yes, since she lives." At that moment d'Avrigny's glance met Noirtier's eye. It glistened with such extraordinary joy, so rich and full of thought, that the physician was struck. He placed the young girl again on the chair. Her lips were scarcely discernible, they were so pale and white, as well as her whole face, and remained motionless, looking at Noirtier, who appeared to anticipate and commend all he did. "Sir," said d'Avrigny to Villefort, "call Mademoiselle Valentine's maid, if you please." Villefort went himself to find her, and d'Avrigny approached Noirtier. "Have you something to tell me?" asked he. The old man winked his eyes expressively, which we may remember was his only way of expressing his approval. "Privately? Yes. Well, I will remain with you." At this moment Villefort returned, followed by the lady's maid, and after her came Madame de Villefort. "What is the matter, then, with this dear child?" "She has just left me, and she complained of being indisposed, but I did not think seriously of it." The young woman, with tears in her eyes and every mark of affection of a true mother, approached Valentine and took her hand. d'Avrigny continued to look at Noirtier. He saw the eyes of the old man dilate and become round, his cheeks turn pale and tremble. The perspiration stood in drops upon his forehead. "Ah," said he, involuntarily following Noirtier's eyes, which were fixed on Madame de Villefort, who repeated, "This poor child would be better in bed. Come, Fanny, we will put her to bed." D'Avrigny, who saw that would be a means of his remaining alone with Noirtier, expressed his opinion that it was the best thing that could be done. But he forbade that anything should be given to her except what he ordered. They carried Valentine away. She had revived, but could scarcely move or speak, so shaken was her frame by the attack. She had, however, just power to give one parting look to her grandfather, who in losing her seemed to be resigning his very soul. d'Avrigny followed the invalid, wrote a prescription, ordered Villefort to take a cabriolet, go in person to a chemist to get the prescribed medicine, bring it himself, and wait for him in his daughter's room. Then, having renewed his injunction not to give Valentine anything, he went down again to Noirtier, shut the doors carefully, and after convincing himself that no one was listening, Monte Cristo uttered the last words with so much meaning that Morrel, starting up, cried out, "You know of whom I speak, Count, do you not?" "Perfectly well, my good friend, and I will prove it to you by putting the dots to the I, or rather by naming the persons. You were walking one evening in M. de Villefort's garden. From what you relate, I suppose it to have been the evening of Madame de Saint-Méran's death. You heard M. de Villefort talking to M. d'Avrigny about the death of M. de Saint-Méran, and that no less surprising of the Countess. M. D'Avrigny said he believed they both proceeded from poison. And you, honest man, have ever since been asking your heart and sounding your conscience to know if you ought to expose or conceal this secret. We are no longer in the Middle Ages. There is no longer a Vemgericht or free tribunals. What do you want to ask these people? Conscience, what hast thou to do with me? As Sterne said, my dear fellow, let them sleep on if they are asleep. Let them grow pale in their drowsiness, if they are disposed to do so, and pray do you remain in peace, who have no remorse to disturb you. Deep grief was depicted on Morel's features. He seized Monte Cristo's hand. But it is beginning again, I say. Well, said the Count, astonished at his perseverance, which he could not understand, and looking still more earnestly at Maximilian. Let it begin again. It is like the house of the Atridae wink with a frown 19 God has condemned them, and they must submit to their punishment. They will all disappear, like the fabrics children build with cards, and which fall, one by one, under the breath of their builder, even if there are 200 of them. 3 months since it was M. de Saint-Méran. Madame de Saint-Méran 2 months since. The other day it was Barrois. Today the old Noirtier or young Valentine. You knew it? Cried Morel, in such a paroxysm of terror that Monte Cristo started. He whom the falling heavens would have found unmoved. You knew it and said nothing? And what is it to me? Replied Monte Cristo, shrugging his shoulders. Do I know those people? And must I lose the one to save the other? Faith, no, for between the culprit and the victim I have no choice. But I, cried Morel, groaning with sorrow, I love her. You love? Whom? Cried Monte Cristo, starting to his feet, and seizing the 2 hands which Morel was raising towards heaven. I love most fondly. I love madly. I love as a man who would give his lifeblood to spare her a tear. I love Valentine de Villefort, who is being murdered at this moment. Do you understand me? I love her. And I ask God and you how I can save her. Monte Cristo uttered a cry which those only can conceive who have heard the roar of a wounded lion. Unhappy man, cried he, wringing his hands in his turn. You love Valentine, that daughter of an accursed race. Never had Morel witnessed such an expression. Never had so terrible an eye flashed before his face. Never had the genius of terror he had so often seen, either on the battlefield or in the murderous nights of Algeria, shaken around him more dreadful fire. He drew back terrified. As for Monte Cristo, after this ebullition he closed his eyes as if dazzled by internal light. In a moment he restrained himself so powerfully that the tempestuous heaving of his breast subsided, as turbulent and foaming waves yield to the sun's genial influence when the cloud has passed. This silence, self-control, and struggle lasted about 20 seconds. Then the Count raised his pallid face. See, said he, my dear friend, how God punishes the most thoughtless and unfeeling men for their indifference, by presenting dreadful scenes to their view. I, who was looking on, an eager and curious spectator. I, who was watching the working of this mournful tragedy. I, who like a wicked angel was laughing at the evil men committed protected by secrecy. A secret is easily kept by the rich and powerful. I am in my turn bitten by the serpent whose tortuous course I was watching, and bitten to the heart. Morel groaned. Come, come, continued the Count. Complaints are unavailing. Be a man, be strong, be full of hope, for I am here and will watch over you. Morel shook his head sorrowfully. I tell you to hope. Do you understand me? Cried Monte Cristo. Remember that I never uttered a falsehood and am never deceived. It is 12 o'clock, Maximilian. Thank heaven that you came at noon rather than in the evening, or tomorrow morning. Listen, Morel, it is noon. If Valentine is not now dead, she will not die. How so? Cried Morel. When I left her dying? Monte Cristo pressed his hands to his forehead. What was passing in that brain, so loaded with dreadful secrets? What does the angel of light or the angel of darkness say to that mind, at once implacable and generous? God only knows. Monte Cristo raised his head once more, and this time he was calm as a child awaking from its sleep. Maximilian, said he, return home. I command you not to stir. Attempt nothing, not to let your countenance betray a thought, and I will send you tidings. Go. Oh, Count, you overwhelm me with that coolness. Have you, then, power against death? Are you superhuman? Are you an angel? And the young man, who had never shrunk from danger, shrank before Monte Cristo with indescribable terror. But Monte Cristo looked at him with so melancholy and sweet a smile that Maximilian felt the tears filling his eyes. "I can do much for you, my friend," replied the Count. "Go, I must be alone." Moral: subdued by the extraordinary ascendancy Monte Cristo exercised over everything around him, did not endeavor to resist it. He pressed the Count's hand and left. He stopped one moment at the door for Baptistin, whom he saw in the Rue Matignon, and who was running meanwhile. Villefort and d'Avrigny had made all possible haste. Valentine had not revived from her fainting fit on their arrival, and the doctor examined the invalid with all the care the circumstances demanded, and with an interest which the knowledge of the secret intensified twofold. Villefort, closely watching his countenance and his lips, awaited the result of the examination. Noirtier, paler than even the young girl, more eager than Villefort for the decision, was watching also intently and affectionately. At last d'Avrigny slowly uttered these words. "She is still alive." "Still!" cried Villefort. "Oh, doctor, what a dreadful word is that!" "Yes," said the physician. "I repeat it. She is still alive, and I am astonished at it." "But is she safe?" asked the father. "Yes, since she lives." At that moment d'Avrigny's glance met Noirtier's eye. It glistened with such extraordinary joy, so rich and full of thought, that the physician was struck. He placed the young girl again on the chair. Her lips were scarcely discernible, they were so pale and white, as well as her whole face, and remained motionless, looking at Noirtier, who appeared to anticipate and commend all he did. "Sir," said d'Avrigny to Villefort, "call Mademoiselle Valentine's maid, if you please." Villefort went himself to find her, and d'Avrigny approached Noirtier. "Have you something to tell me?" asked he. The old man winked his eyes expressively, which we may remember was his only way of expressing his approval. "Privately? Yes. Well, I will remain with you." At this moment Villefort returned, followed by the lady's maid, and after her came Madame de Villefort. "What is the matter, then, with this dear child? She has just left me, and she complained of being indisposed, but I did not think seriously of it." The young woman, with tears in her eyes and every mark of affection of a true mother, approached Valentine and took her hand. D'Avrigny continued to look at Noirtier. He saw the eyes of the old man dilate and become round, his cheeks turn pale and tremble. The perspiration stood in drops upon his forehead. "Ah," said he, involuntarily following Noirtier's eyes, which were fixed on Madame de Villefort, who repeated, "This poor child would be better in bed. Come, Fanny, we will put her to bed." D'Avrigny, who saw that would be a means of his remaining alone with Noirtier, expressed his opinion that it was the best thing that could be done. But he forbade that anything should be given to her except what he ordered. They carried Valentine away. She had revived, but could scarcely move or speak, so shaken was her frame by the attack. She had, however, just power to give one parting look to her grandfather, who in losing her seemed to be resigning his very soul. D'Avrigny followed the invalid, wrote a prescription, ordered Villefort to take a cabriolet, go in person to a chemist's to get the prescribed medicine, bring it himself, and wait for him in his daughter's room. Then, having renewed his injunction not to give Valentine anything, he went down again to Noirtier, shut the doors carefully, and after convincing himself that no one was listening, "Do you," said he, "know anything of this young lady's illness?" "Yes," said the old man. "We have no time to lose. I will question, and do you answer me?" Noirtier made a sign that he was ready to answer. "Did you anticipate the accident which has happened to your granddaughter?" "Yes." D'Avrigny reflected a moment. Then approaching Noirtier, "Pardon what I am going to say," added he, "but no indication should be neglected in this terrible situation. Did you see poor Berois die?" Noirtier raised his eyes to heaven. "Do you know of what he died?" asked d'Avrigny, placing his hand on Noirtier's shoulder. "Yes," replied the old man. "Do you think he died a natural death?" A sort of smile was discernible on the motionless lips of Noirtier. "Then you have thought that Berois was poisoned?" "Yes." Do you think the poison he fell a victim to was intended for him? No. Do you think the same hand which unintentionally struck Berois has now attacked Valentine? Yes. Then will she die too? Asked D'Avrigny, fixing his penetrating gaze on Noirtier. He watched the effect of this question on the old man. No, replied he with an air of triumph which would have puzzled the most clever diviner. Then you hope? Said D'Avrigny with surprise. Yes. What do you hope? The old man made him understand with his eyes that he could not answer. Ah, yes, it is true, murmured D'Avrigny. Then, turning to Noirtier, do you hope the assassin will be tried? No. Then you hope the poison will take no effect on Valentine? Yes. It is no news to you, added D'Avrigny, to tell you that an attempt has been made to poison her? The old man made a sign that he entertained no doubt upon the subject. Then how do you hope Valentine will escape? Noirtier kept his eyes steadfastly fixed on the same spot. D'Avrigny followed the direction and saw that they were fixed on a bottle containing the mixture which he took every morning. Ah, indeed? Said D'Avrigny, struck with a sudden thought. Has it occurred to you? Noirtier did not let him finish. Yes, said he. To prepare her system to resist poison? Yes. By accustoming her by degrees. Yes, 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 said Noirtier, delighted to be understood. Of course, I had told you that there was brucine in the mixture I give you. Yes. And by accustoming her to that poison, you have endeavored to neutralize the effect of a similar poison? Noirtier's joy continued. And you have succeeded, exclaimed D'Avrigny. Without that precaution Valentine would have died before assistance could have been procured. The dose has been excessive, but she has only been shaken by it. And this time, at any rate, Valentine will not die. A superhuman joy expanded the old man's eyes, which were raised towards heaven with an expression of infinite gratitude. At this moment Villefort returned. Here, doctor, said he, is what you sent me for. Was this prepared in your presence? Yes, replied the procureur. Have you not let it go out of your hands? No. D'Avrigny took the bottle, poured some drops of the mixture it contained in the hollow of his hand, and swallowed them. Well, said he, let us go to Valentine. I will give instructions to everyone, and you, de Villefort, will yourself see that no one deviates from them. For 029 format, the moment when D'Avrigny was returning to Valentine's room, accompanied by Villefort, an Italian priest, of serious demeanor and calm and firm tone, hired for his use the house adjoining the hotel of M. de Villefort. No one knew how the 3 former tenants of that house left it. About 2 hours afterwards its foundation was reported to be unsafe, but the report did not prevent the new occupant establishing himself there with his modest furniture the same day at 5 o'clock. The lease was drawn up for 3, 6, or 9 years by the new tenant, who, according to the rule of the proprietor, paid 6 months in advance. This new tenant, who, as we have said, was an Italian, was called Il Signor Giacomo Busoni. Workmen were immediately called in, and that same night the passengers at the end of the faubourg saw with surprise that carpenters and masons were occupied in repairing the lower part of the tottering house. Chapter 95. Father and daughter. We saw in a preceding chapter how Madame Danglars went formally to announce to Madame de Villefort the approaching marriage of Eugénie Danglars and M. Andrea Cavalcanti. This formal announcement, which implied or appeared to imply the approval of all the persons concerned in this momentous affair, had been preceded by a scene to which our readers must be admitted. We beg them to take one step backward and to transport themselves, the morning of that day of great catastrophes, into the showy, gilded salon we have before shown them, and which was the pride of its owner, Baron Danglars. In this room, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, the banker himself had been walking to and fro for some minutes thoughtfully and in evident uneasiness, watching both doors and listening to every sound. When his patience was exhausted, he called his valet. Etienne, said he, see why Mademoiselle Eugénie has asked me to meet her in the drawing-room, and why she makes me wait so long. Having given this vent to his ill humor, the Baron became more calm. Mademoiselle Danglars had that morning requested an interview with her father, and had fixed on the gilded drawing-room as the spot. The singularity of this step, and above all its formality, had not a little surprised the banker, who had immediately obeyed his daughter by repairing first to the drawing-room. Etienne soon returned from his errand. Mademoiselle's lady's maid says, sir, that mademoiselle is finishing her toilette and will be here shortly. Danglars nodded, to signify that he was satisfied. To the world and to his servants Danglars assumed the character of the good-natured man and the indulgent father. This was one of his parts in the popular comedy he was performing, a make-up he had adopted and which suited him about as well as the masks worn on the classic stage by paternal actors, who seen from one side, were the image of geniality, and from the other showed lips drawn down in chronic ill-temper. Let us hasten to say that in private the genial side descended to the level of the other, so that generally the indulgent man disappeared to give place to the brutal husband and domineering father. Why the devil does that foolish girl, who pretends to wish to speak to me, not come into my study? And why on earth does she want to speak to me at all? He was turning this thought over in his brain for the 20th time, when the door opened and Eugenie appeared, attired in a figured black satin dress, her hair dressed and gloves on, as if she were going to the Italian opera. Well, Eugenie, what is it you want with me? And why in this solemn drawing-room when the study is so comfortable? I quite understand why you ask, sir, said Eugenie, making a sign that her father might be seated. And in fact your two questions suggest fully the theme of our conversation. I will answer them both, and contrary to the usual method, the last first, because it is the least difficult. I have chosen the drawing-room, sir, as our place of meeting, in order to avoid the disagreeable impressions and influences of a banker's study. Those gilded cash books, drawers locked like gates of fortresses, heaps of bank bills, come from I know not where, and the quantities of letters from England, Holland, Spain, India, China, and Peru, have generally a strange influence on a father's mind, and make him forget that there is in the world an interest greater and more sacred than the good opinion of his correspondents. I have, therefore, chosen this drawing-room, where you see, smiling and happy in their magnificent frames, your portrait, mine, my mother's, and all sorts of rural landscapes and touching pastorals. I rely much on external impressions. Perhaps, with regard to you, they are immaterial, but I should be no artist if I had not some fancies. Very well, replied M. Danglars, who had listened to all this preamble with imperturbable coolness, but without understanding a word, since like every man burdened with thoughts of the past, he was occupied with seeking the thread of his own ideas in those of the speaker. There is, then, the second point cleared up, or nearly so, said Eugenie, without the least confusion, and with that masculine pointedness which distinguished her gesture and her language. And you appear satisfied with the explanation. Now let us return to the first. You ask me why I have requested this interview. I will tell you in 2 words, sir. I will not marry Count Andrea Cavalcanti. Danglars leaped from his chair and raised his eyes and arms towards heaven. 40298. Yes, indeed, sir, continued Eugenie, still quite calm. You are astonished, I see, for since this little affair began, I have not manifested the slightest opposition, and yet I am always sure, when the opportunity arrives, to oppose a determined and absolute will to people who have not consulted me, and things which displease me. However, this time my tranquility or passiveness, as philosophers say, proceeded from another source. It proceeded from a wish, like a submissive and devoted daughter. A slight smile was observable on the purple lips of the young girl. To practice obedience. Well? Asked Danglars. Well, sir, replied Eugenie. I have tried to the very last, and now that the moment has come, I feel in spite of all my efforts that it is impossible. But, said Danglars, whose weak mind was at first quite overwhelmed with the weight of this pitiless logic, marking evident premeditation and force of will. What is your reason for this refusal, Eugenie? What reason do you assign? My reason, replied the young girl. Well, it is not that the man is more ugly, more foolish, or more disagreeable than any other. No, Andrea Cavalcanti may appear to those who look at men's faces and figures as a very good specimen of his kind. It is not, either, that my heart is less touched by him than any other. That would be a schoolgirl's reason, which I consider quite beneath me. I actually love no one, sir. You know it, do you not? I do not then see why, without real necessity, I should encumber my life with a perpetual companion. Has not some sage said, nothing too much? And another, I carry all my effects with me? I have been taught these two aphorisms in Latin and in Greek. One is, I believe, from Phaedrus and the other from Bias. Well, my dear father, in the shipwreck of life, for life is an eternal shipwreck of our hopes, I cast into the sea my useless encumbrance, that is all, and I remain with my own will, disposed to live perfectly alone, and consequently perfectly free. Unhappy girl, murmured Danglars, turning pale, for he knew from long experience the solidity of the obstacle he had so suddenly encountered. Unhappy girl, replied Eugénie. Unhappy girl, do you say, sir? No, indeed. The exclamation appears quite theatrical and affected. Happy, on the contrary, for what am I in want of? The world calls me beautiful. It is something to be well received. I like a favorable reception. It expands the countenance, and those around me do not then appear so ugly. I possess a share of wit and a certain relative sensibility, which enables me to draw from life in general, for the support of mine, all I meet with that is good, like the monkey who cracks the nut to get at its contents. I am rich, for you have one of the first fortunes in France. I am your only daughter, and you are not so exacting as the fathers of the Porte Saint-Martin and Gaieté, who disinherit their daughters for not giving them grandchildren. Besides, the provident law has deprived you of the power to disinherit me, at least entirely, as it has also of the power to compel me to marry monsieur this or monsieur that. And so, being beautiful, witty, somewhat talented, as the comic operas say, and rich, and that is happiness, sir. Why do you call me unhappy? Danglars, seeing his daughter smiling, and proud even to insolence, could not entirely repress his brutal feelings, but they betrayed themselves only by an exclamation. Under the fixed and inquiring gaze leveled at him from under those beautiful black eyebrows, he prudently turned away and calmed himself immediately, daunted by the power of a resolute mind. Truly, my daughter, replied he with a smile, you are all you boast of being, excepting one thing. I will not too hastily tell you which, but would rather leave you to guess it. Eugénie looked at Danglars, much surprised that one flower of her crown of pride, with which she had so superbly decked herself, should be disputed. My daughter, continued the banker, you have perfectly explained to me the sentiments which influence a girl like you, who is determined she will not marry. Now it remains for me to tell you the motives of a father like me, who has decided that his daughter shall marry. Eugénie bowed, not as a submissive daughter, but as an adversary prepared for a discussion. My daughter, continued Danglars, when a father asks his daughter to choose a husband, he has always some reason for wishing her to marry. Some are affected with the mania of which you spoke just now, that of living again in their grandchildren. This is not my weakness, I tell you at once. Family joys have no charm for me. I may acknowledge this to a daughter whom I know to be philosophical enough to understand my indifference, and not to impute it to me as a crime. This is not to the purpose, said Eugénie. Let us speak candidly, sir. I admire candor. Oh, said Danglars. I can, when circumstances render it desirable, adopt your system, although it may not be my general practice. I will therefore proceed. I have proposed to you to marry, not for your sake, for indeed I did not think of you in the least at the moment. You admire candor, and will now be satisfied, I hope. But because it suited me to marry you as soon as possible, on account of certain commercial speculations I am desirous of entering into. Eugénie became uneasy. 40302 It is just as I tell you, I assure you, and you must not be angry with me, for you have sought this disclosure. I do not willingly enter into arithmetical explanations with an artist like you, who fears to enter my study lest she should imbibe disagreeable or anti-poetic impressions and sensations. But in that same banker's study, where you very willingly presented yourself yesterday to ask for the 1,000 francs I give you monthly for pocket money, you must know, my dear young lady, that many things may be learned, useful even to a girl who will not marry. There one may learn, for instance, what, out of regard to your nervous susceptibility, I will inform you of in the drawing-room, namely, that the credit of a banker is his physical and moral life, that credit sustains him as breath animates the body, and M. de Monte Cristo once gave me a lecture on that subject which I have never forgotten. There we may learn that as credit sinks, the body becomes a corpse, and this is what must happen very soon to the banker who is proud to own so good a logician as you for his daughter. But Eugénie, instead of stooping, drew herself up under the blow. Ruined? Said she. Exactly, my daughter. That is precisely what I mean, said Danglars, almost digging his nails into his breast, while he preserved on his harsh features the smile of the heartless though clever man. Ruined, yes, that is it. Ah, said Eugenie. Yes, ruined. Now it is revealed. This secret so full of horror, as the tragic poet says. Now, my daughter, learn from my lips how you may alleviate this misfortune, so far as it will affect you. Oh, cried Eugenie, you are a bad physiognomist, if you imagine I deplore on my own account the catastrophe of which you warn me. I ruined? And what will that signify to me? Have I not my talent left? Can I not, like Pasta, Malibran, Grisi, acquire for myself what you would never have given me, whatever might have been your fortune, 100 or 150,000 livres per annum, for which I shall be indebted to no one but myself, and which, instead of being given as you gave me those poor 12,000 francs, with sour looks and reproaches for my prodigality, will be accompanied with acclamations, with bravos, and with flowers? And if I do not possess that talent, which your smiles prove to me you doubt, should I not still have that ardent love of independence, which will be a substitute for wealth, and which in my mind supersedes even the instinct of self-preservation? No, I grieve not on my own account. I shall always find a resource. My books, my pencils, my piano, all the things which cost but little, and which I shall be able to procure, will remain my own. Do you think that I sorrow for Madame Danglars? Undeceive yourself again. Either I am greatly mistaken, or she has provided against the catastrophe which threatens you, and which will pass over without affecting her. She has taken care for herself, at least I hope so, for her attention has not been diverted from her projects by watching over me. She has fostered my independence by professedly indulging my love for liberty. Oh no, sir. From my childhood I have seen too much and understood too much of what has passed around me, for misfortune to have an undue power over me. From my earliest recollections, I have been beloved by no one, so much the worse. That has naturally led me to love no one, so much the better. Now you have my profession of faith. Then, said Danglars, pale with anger, which was not at all due to offended paternal love. Then, mademoiselle, you persist in your determination to accelerate my ruin? Your ruin? I accelerate your ruin? What do you mean? I do not understand you. So much the better. I have a ray of hope left. Listen. I am all attention, said Eugenie, looking so earnestly at her father that it was an effort for the latter to endure her unrelenting gaze. M. Cavalcanti, continued Danglars, is about to marry you and will place in my hands his fortune, amounting to 3,000,000 livres. That is admirable, said Eugenie with sovereign contempt, smoothing her gloves out one upon the other. You think I shall deprive you of those 3,000,000s, said Danglars. But do not fear it. They are destined to produce at least 10. I and a brother banker have obtained a grant of a railway, the only industrial enterprise which in these days promises to make good the fabulous prospects that law once held out to the eternally deluded Parisians in the fantastic Mississippi scheme. As I look at it, a millionth part of a railway is worth fully as much as an acre of waste land on the banks of the Ohio. We make in our case a deposit on a mortgage which is an advance, as you see, since we gain at least 10, 15, 20, or 100 livres worth of iron in exchange for our money. Well, within a week I am to deposit 4 millions for my share. The 4 millions, I promise you, will produce 10 or 12. But during my visit to you the day before yesterday, sir, which you appear to recollect so well, replied Eugenie, I saw you arranging a deposit, is not that the term? Of 5 millions and a half. You even pointed it out to me in 2 drafts on the treasury, and you were astonished that so valuable a paper did not dazzle my eyes like lightning. Yes, but those 5 millions and a half are not mine, and are only a proof of the great confidence placed in me. My title of popular banker has gained me the confidence of charitable institutions, and the 5 millions and a half belong to them. At any other time I should not have hesitated to make use of them, but the great losses I have recently sustained are well known, and, as I told you, my credit is rather shaken. That deposit may be at any moment withdrawn, and if I had employed it for another purpose, I should bring on me a disgraceful bankruptcy. I do not despise bankruptcies, believe me, but they must be those which enrich, not those which ruin. Now, if you marry M. Cavalcanti, and I get the 3 millions, or even if it is thought I am going to get them, my credit will be restored, and my fortune, which for the last month or two has been swallowed up in gulfs which have been opened in my path by an inconceivable fatality, will revive. Do you understand me? Perfectly. You pledge me for 3 millions, do you not? The greater the amount, the more flattering it is to you. It gives you an idea of your value. Thank you. One word more, sir. Do you promise me to make what use you can of the report of the fortune M. Cavalcanti will bring without touching the money? This is no act of selfishness, but of delicacy. I am willing to help rebuild your fortune, but I will not be an accomplice in the ruin of others. But since I tell you, cried Danglars, that with these 3 million, do you expect to recover your position, sir, without touching those 3 million? I hope so, if the marriage should take place and confirm my credit. Shall you be able to pay M. Cavalcanti the 500,000 francs you promise for my dowry? He shall receive them on returning from the mayor's 20. Very well. What next? What more do you want? I wish to know if, in demanding my signature, you leave me entirely free in my person? Absolutely. Then, as I said before, sir, very well, I am ready to marry M. Cavalcanti. But what are you up to? Ah, that is my affair. What advantage should I have over you, if knowing your secret I were to tell you mine? Danglars bit his lips. Then, said he, you are ready to pay the official visits, which are absolutely indispensable? Yes, replied Eugenie. And to sign the contract in 3 days? Yes. Then, in my turn, I also say, very well. Danglars pressed his daughter's hand in his. But, extraordinary to relate, the father did not say, thank you, my child. Nor did the daughter smile at her father. Is the conference ended? Asked Eugenie. Rising, Danglars motioned that he had nothing more to say. 5 minutes afterwards the piano resounded to the touch of Mademoiselle d'Armilly's fingers, and Mademoiselle Danglars was singing Brabantio's malediction on Desdemona. At the end of the piece Etienne entered, and announced to Eugenie that the horses were to the carriage, and that the Baroness was waiting for her to pay her visits. We have seen them at Villefort's. They proceeded then on their course. Chapter 96. The contract 3 days after the scene we have just described, namely towards 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the day fixed for the signature of the contract between Mademoiselle Eugenie Danglars and Andrea Cavalcanti, whom the banker persisted in calling Prince. A fresh breeze was stirring the leaves in the little garden in front of the Count of Monte Cristo's house, and the Count was preparing to go out, while his horses were impatiently pawing the ground, held in by the coachman, who had been seated a quarter of an hour on his box. The elegant phaeton with which we are familiar rapidly turned the angle of the entrance gate, and cast out on the doorsteps M. Andrea Cavalcanti. As decked up and gay as if he were going to marry a princess, he inquired after the Count with his usual familiarity, and ascending lightly to the first story met him at the top of the stairs. The Count stopped on seeing the young man. As for Andrea, he was launched, and when he was once launched nothing stopped him. Ah, good morning, my dear Count, said he. Andrea, said the latter with his half-jesting tone. How do you do? Charmingly, as you see. I am come to talk to you about 1,000 things. But, first tell me, were you going out or just returned? I was going out, sir. Then, in order not to hinder you, I will get up with you if you please in your carriage, and Tom shall follow with my phaeton in tow. No, said the Count, with an imperceptible smile of contempt, for he had no wish to be seen in the young man's society. No, I prefer listening to you here, my dear M. Andrea. We can chat better indoors, and there is no coachman to overhear our conversation. The Count returned to a small drawing-room on the first floor, sat down, and crossing his legs motioned to the young man to take a seat also. Andrea assumed his gayest manner. You know, my dear Count, said he, the ceremony is to take place this evening. At 9 o'clock the contract is to be signed at my father-in-law's. Ah, indeed, said Monte Cristo. What, is it news to you? Has not M. Danglars informed you of the ceremony? Oh, yes, said the Count. I received a letter from him yesterday, but I do not think the hour was mentioned. Possibly my father-in-law trusted to its general notoriety. Well, said Monte Cristo, you are fortunate, M. Cavalcanti. It is a most suitable alliance you are contracting, and Mademoiselle Danglars is a handsome girl." "Yes, indeed she is," replied Cavalcanti in a very modest tone. "Above all, she is very rich, at least I believe so," said Monte Cristo. "Very rich, do you think?" replied the young man. "Doubtless, it is said M. Danglars conceals at least half of his fortune, and he acknowledges 15 or 20 millions," said Andrea with a look sparkling with joy. "Without reckoning," added Monte Cristo, "that he is on the eve of entering into a sort of speculation already in vogue in the United States and in England, but quite novel in France. Yes, yes, I know what you mean. The railway of which he has obtained the grant, is it not?" "Precisely. It is generally believed he will gain 10 millions by that affair." 10 millions? Do you think so? "It is magnificent," said Cavalcanti, who was quite confounded at the metallic sound of these golden words. "Without reckoning," replied Monte Cristo, "that all his fortune will come to you, and justly too, since Mademoiselle Danglars is an only daughter. Besides, your own fortune, as your father assured me, is almost equal to that of your betrothed. But enough of money matters. Do you know, Andrea, I think you have managed this affair rather skillfully?" "Not badly, by any means," said the young man. "I was born for a diplomatist." "Well, you must become a diplomatist. Diplomacy, you know, is something that is not to be acquired. It is instinctive. Have you lost your heart?" "Indeed, I fear it," replied Andrea, in the tone in which he had heard Durante or Villiers reply to Alceste, 21, at the Théâtre Français. "Is your love returned?" "I suppose so," said Andrea with a triumphant smile, "since I am accepted. But I must not forget one grand point." "Which?" "That I have been singularly assisted." "Nonsense." "I have, indeed." "By circumstances?" "No, by you." "By me?" "Not at all, Prince," said Monte Cristo, laying a marked stress on the title. "What have I done for you? Are not your name, your social position, and your merit sufficient?" "No," said Andrea. "No, it is useless for you to say so, Count. I maintain that the position of a man like you has done more than my name, my social position, and my merit." "You are completely mistaken, sir," said Monte Cristo coldly, who felt the perfidious maneuver of the young man, and understood the bearing of his words. "You only acquired my protection after the influence and fortune of your father had been ascertained. For, after all, who procured for me, who had never seen either you or your illustrious father, the pleasure of your acquaintance? Two of my good friends, Lord Wilmore and the Abbé Busoni. What encouraged me not to become your surety, but to patronize you? Your father's name, so well known in Italy and so highly honored. Personally, I do not know you." This calm tone and perfect ease made Andrea feel that he was, for the moment, restrained by a more muscular hand than his own, and that the restraint could not be easily broken through. "Oh, then my father has really a very large fortune, Count?" "It appears so, sir," replied Monte Cristo. "Do you know if the marriage settlement he promised me has come?" "I have been advised of it." "But the 3 millions?" "The 3 millions are probably on the road." "Then I shall really have them?" "Oh, well," said the Count, "I do not think you have yet known the want of money." Andrea was so surprised that he pondered the matter for a moment. Then, arousing from his reverie, "Now, sir, I have one request to make to you, which you will understand, even if it should be disagreeable to you." "Proceed," said Monte Cristo. "I have formed an acquaintance, thanks to my good fortune, with many noted persons, and have, at least for the moment, a crowd of friends. But marrying, as I am about to do, before all Paris, I ought to be supported by an illustrious name, and in the absence of the paternal hand some powerful one ought to lead me to the altar. Now, my father is not coming to Paris, is he? He is old, covered with wounds, and suffers dreadfully, he says, in traveling. I understand. Well, I am come to ask a favor of you." "Of me?" "Yes, of you." "And pray what may it be?" "Well, to take his part." "Ah, my dear sir." "What?" "After the varied relations I have had the happiness to sustain towards you, can it be that you know me so little as to ask such a thing? Ask me to lend you 500,000 and, although such a loan is somewhat rare, on my honor, you would annoy me less. No, then, what I thought I had already told you, that in participation in this world's affairs, more especially in their moral aspects, the Count of Monte Cristo has never ceased to entertain the scruples and even the superstitions of the East. I, who have a seraglio at Cairo, one at Smyrna, and one at Constantinople, preside at a wedding? Never. Then you refuse me? Decidedly. And were you my son or my brother, I would refuse you in the same way. But what must be done? Said Andrea, disappointed. You said just now that you had 100 friends. Very true, but you introduced me at M. Danglars. Not at all. Let us recall the exact facts. You met him at a dinner party at my house, and you introduced yourself at his house. That is a totally different affair. Yes, but by my marriage you have forwarded that. Not in the least, I beg you to believe. Recollect what I told you when you asked me to propose you. Oh, I never make matches, my dear prince. It is my settled principle. Andrea bit his lips. But at least you will be there? Will all Paris be there? Oh, certainly. Well, like all Paris, I shall be there too, said the Count. And will you sign the contract? I see no objection to that. My scruples do not go thus far. Well, since you will grant me no more, I must be content with what you give me. But one word more, Count. What is it? Advice. Be careful. Advice is worse than a service. Oh, you can give me this without compromising yourself. Tell me what it is. Is my wife's fortune 500,000 livres? That is the sum M. Danglars himself announced. Must I receive it, or leave it in the hands of the notary? This is the way such affairs are generally arranged when it is wished to do them stylishly. Your two solicitors appoint a meeting, when the contract is signed, for the next or the following day. Then they exchange the two portions, for which they each give a receipt. Then, when the marriage is celebrated, they place the amount at your disposal as the chief member of the alliance. Because, said Andrea, with a certain ill-concealed uneasiness, I thought I heard my father-in-law say that he intended embarking our property in that famous railway affair of which you spoke just now. Well, replied Monte Cristo, it will be the way, everybody says, of trebling your fortune in 12 months. Baron Danglars is a good father, and knows how to calculate. In that case, said Andrea, everything is all right excepting your refusal, which quite grieves me. You must attribute it only to natural scruples under similar circumstances. Well, said Andrea, let it be as you wish. This evening, then, at 9 o'clock. Adieu till then. Notwithstanding a slight resistance on the part of Monte Cristo, whose lips turned pale, but who preserved his ceremonious smile, Andrea seized the Count's hand, pressed it, jumped into his phaeton, and disappeared the 4 or 5 remaining hours before 9 o'clock arrived. Andrea employed in riding, paying visits, designed to induce those of whom he had spoken to appear at the bankers in their gayest equipages, dazzling them by promises of shares in schemes which have since turned every brain, and in which Danglars was just taking the initiative. In fact, at 8:30 in the evening the grand salon, the gallery adjoining, and the 3 other drawing rooms on the same floor were filled with a perfumed crowd, who sympathized but little in the event, but who all participated in that love of being present wherever there is anything fresh to be seen. An academician would say that the entertainments of the fashionable world are collections of flowers which attract inconstant butterflies, famished bees, and buzzing drones. 50025 and no one could deny that the rooms were splendidly illuminated. The light streamed forth on the gilt moldings and the silk hangings, and all the bad taste of decorations, which had only their richness to boast of, shone in its splendor. Mademoiselle Eugénie was dressed with elegant simplicity in a figured white silk dress, and a white rose half concealed in her jet-black hair was her only ornament, unaccompanied by a single jewel. Her eyes, however, betrayed that perfect confidence which contradicted the girlish simplicity of this modest attire. Madame Danglars was chatting at a short distance with Debray, Beauchamp, and Châteaurenaud. Debray was admitted to the house for this grand ceremony, but on the same plane with everyone else, and without any particular privilege. M. Danglars, surrounded by deputies and men connected with the revenue, was explaining a new theory of taxation which he intended to adopt when the course of events had compelled the government to call him into the ministry. Andrea, on whose arm hung one of the most consummate dandies of the opera, was explaining to him rather cleverly, since he was obliged to be bold to appear at ease, his future projects, and the new luxuries he meant to introduce to Parisian fashions with his 175,000 livres per annum. The crowd moved to and fro in the rooms like an ebb and flow of turquoises, rubies, emeralds, opals, and diamonds. As usual, the oldest women were the most decorated, and the ugliest the most conspicuous. If there was a beautiful lily, or a sweet rose, you had to search for it, concealed in some corner behind a mother with a turban, or an ant with a bird of paradise each moment. In the midst of the crowd, the buzzing and the laughter, the doorkeeper's voice was heard announcing some name well known in the financial department, respected in the army, or illustrious in the literary world, and which was acknowledged by a slight movement in the different groups. But for one whose privilege it was to agitate that ocean of human waves, how many were received with a look of indifference or a sneer of disdain? At the moment when the hand of the massive timepiece, representing Endymion asleep, pointed to 9 on its golden face, and the hammer, the faithful type of mechanical thought, struck 9 times, the name of the Count of Monte Cristo resounded in its turn, and as if by an electric shock all the assembly turned towards the door. The Count was dressed in black and with his habitual simplicity. His white waistcoat displayed his expansive noble chest, and his black stock was singularly noticeable because of its contrast with the deadly paleness of his face. His only jewelry was a chain, so fine that the slender gold thread was scarcely perceptible on his white waistcoat. A circle was immediately formed around the door. The Count perceived at one glance Madame Danglars at one end of the drawing-room, M. Danglars at the other, and Eugénie in front of him. He first advanced towards the Baroness, who was chatting with Madame de Villefort, who had come alone, Valentine being still an invalid, and without turning aside, so clear was the road left for him, he passed from the Baroness to Eugénie, whom he complimented in such rapid and measured terms that the proud artist was quite struck. Near her was Mademoiselle Louise d'Armilly, who thanked the Count for the letters of introduction he had so kindly given her for Italy, which she intended immediately to make use of. On leaving these ladies he found himself with Danglars, who had advanced to meet him, having accomplished these 3 social duties. Monte Cristo stopped, looking around him with that expression peculiar to a certain class, which seems to say, "I have done my duty, now let others do theirs." Andrea, who was in an adjoining room, had shared in the sensation caused by the arrival of Monte Cristo, and now came forward to pay his respects to the Count. He found him completely surrounded. All were eager to speak to him, as is always the case with those whose words are few and weighty. The solicitors arrived at this moment and arranged their scrawled papers on the velvet cloth embroidered with gold which covered the table prepared for the signature. It was a gilt table supported on lion's claws. One of the notaries sat down, the other remained standing. They were about to proceed to the reading of the contract, which half Paris assembled was to sign. All took their places, or rather the ladies formed a circle, while the gentlemen, more indifferent to the restraints of what Boileau calls the style énergique, commented on the feverish agitation of Andrea, on M. Danglars' riveted attention, Eugénie's composure, and the light and sprightly manner in which the Baroness treated this important affair. The contract was read during a profound silence. But as soon as it was finished, the buzz was redoubled through all the drawing-rooms. The brilliant sums, the rolling millions which were to be at the command of the 2 young people, and which crowned the display of the wedding presents and the young lady's diamonds, which had been made in a room entirely appropriated for that purpose, had exercised to the full their delusions over the envious assembly. Mademoiselle Danglars' charms were heightened in the opinion of the young men, and for the moment seemed to outvie the sun in splendor. As for the ladies, it is needless to say that while they coveted the millions, they thought they did not need them for themselves, as they were beautiful enough without them. Andrea, surrounded by his friends, complimented, flattered, beginning to believe in the reality of his dream, was almost bewildered. The notary solemnly took the pen, flourished it above his head, and said, "Gentlemen, we are about to sign the contract." The Baron was to sign first, then the representative of M. Cavalcanti Sr., then the Baroness, afterwards the future couple, as they are styled in the abominable phraseology of legal documents. The Baron took the pen and signed, then the representative. The Baroness approached, leaning on Madame de Villefort's arm. "My dear," said she as she took the pen, "is it not vexatious? An unexpected incident, in the affair of murder and theft at the Count of Monte Cristo's, in which he nearly fell a victim, deprives us of the pleasure of seeing M. de Villefort. Indeed? Said M. Danglars, in the same tone in which he would have said, "Oh, well, what do I care?" "As a matter of fact," said Monte Cristo, approaching, "I am much afraid that I am the involuntary cause of his absence." "What, you, Count?" said Madame Danglars, signing. "If you are, take care, for I shall never forgive you." Andrea pricked up his ears. "But it is not my fault, as I shall endeavor to prove." Everyone listened eagerly. Monte Cristo, who so rarely opened his lips, was about to speak. "You remember," said the Count, during the most profound silence, "that the unhappy wretch who came to rob me died at my house. The supposition is that he was stabbed by his accomplice, on attempting to leave it." "Yes," said Danglars. "In order that his wounds might be examined, he was undressed, and his clothes were thrown into a corner, where the police picked them up, with the exception of the waistcoat, which they overlooked." Andrea turned pale and drew towards the door. He saw a cloud rising in the horizon, which appeared to forebode a coming storm. "Well, this waistcoat was discovered today, covered with blood, and with a hole over the heart. The ladies screamed, and 2 or 3 prepared to faint. It was brought to me. No one could guess what the dirty rag could be. I alone suspected that it was the waistcoat of the murdered man. My valet, in examining this mournful relic, felt a paper in the pocket and drew it out. It was a letter addressed to you, Baron." "To me?" cried Danglars. "Yes, indeed, to you. I succeeded in deciphering your name under the blood with which the letter was stained," replied Monte Cristo, amid the general outburst of amazement. "But," asked Madame Danglars, looking at her husband with uneasiness, "how could that prevent M. de Villefort?" "In this simple way, madame," replied Monte Cristo. "The waistcoat and the letter were both what is termed circumstantial evidence. I therefore sent them to the king's attorney. You understand, my dear Baron, that legal methods are the safest in criminal cases. It was, perhaps, some plot against you." Andrea looked steadily at Monte Cristo and disappeared in the second drawing-room. "Possibly," said Danglars. "Was not this murdered man an old galley slave?" 50025 "Yes," replied the Count. "A felon named Cataris." Danglars turned slightly pale. Andrea reached the anteroom beyond the little drawing-room. "But go on signing," said Monte Cristo. "I perceive that my story has caused a general emotion, and I beg to apologize to you, Baroness, and to Mademoiselle Danglars." The Baroness, who had signed, returned the pen to the notary. "Prince Cavalcanti," said the latter. "Prince Cavalcanti, where are you?" Andrea," repeated several young people, who were already on sufficiently intimate terms with him to call him by his Christian name. "Call the prince. Inform him that it is his turn to sign," cried Danglars to one of the floor-keepers. But at the same instant the crowd of guests rushed in alarm into the principal salon as if some frightful monster had entered the apartments, quirens quem deveret. There was, indeed, reason to retreat, to be alarmed, and to scream. An officer was placing 2 soldiers at the door of each drawing-room, and was advancing towards Danglars, preceded by a commissary of police, girded with his scarf. Madame Danglars uttered a scream and fainted. Danglars, who thought himself threatened, certain consciences are never calm. Danglars, even before his guests, showed a countenance of abject terror. "What is the matter, sir?" asked Monte Cristo, advancing to meet the commissioner. "Which of you gentlemen," asked the magistrate, without replying to the Count, "answers to the name of Andrea Cavalcanti?" A cry of astonishment was heard from all parts of the room. They searched, they questioned. "But who then is Andrea Cavalcanti?" asked Danglars in amazement. "A galley slave, escaped from confinement at Toulon." "And what crime has he committed?" "He is accused," said the commissary with his inflexible voice, "of having assassinated the man named Cataris, his former companion in prison, at the moment he was making his escape from the house of the Count of Monte Cristo." Monte Cristo cast a rapid glance around him. Andrea was gone. Chapter 97. The departure for Belgium. A few minutes after the scene of confusion produced in the salons of M. Danglars by the unexpected appearance of the brigade of soldiers, and by the disclosure which had followed, the mansion was deserted with as much rapidity as if a case of plague or of cholera morbus had broken out among the guests in a few minutes. Through all the doors, down all the staircases, by every exit, everyone hastened to retire, or rather to fly, for it was a situation where the ordinary condolences, which even the best friends are so eager to offer in great catastrophes, were seen to be utterly futile. There remained in the banker's house only Danglars, closeted in his study, and making his statement to the officer of gendarmes. Madame Danglars, terrified, in the boudoir with which we are acquainted, and Eugénie, who with haughty air and disdainful lip had retired to her room with her inseparable companion, Mademoiselle Louise d'Armilly. As for the numerous servants, more numerous that evening than usual, for their number was augmented by cooks and butlers from the Café de Paris, venting on their employers their anger at what they termed the insult to which they had been subjected, they collected in groups in the hall, in the kitchens, or in their rooms, thinking very little of their duty, which was thus naturally interrupted. Of all this household, only two persons deserve our notice. These are Mademoiselle Eugénie Danglars and Mademoiselle Louise d'Armilly. The betrothed had retired, as we said, with haughty air, disdainful lip, and the demeanor of an outraged queen, followed by her companion, who was paler and more disturbed than herself. On reaching her room, Eugénie locked her door, while Louise fell on a chair. "Ah, what a dreadful thing," said the young musician. "Who would have suspected it? Andrea Cavalcanti a murderer, a galley slave escaped, a convict." An ironical smile curled the lip of Eugénie. "In truth, I was fated," said she. "I escaped the Morcerf only to fall into the Cavalcanti. Oh, do not confound the two, Eugénie. Hold your tongue. The men are all infamous, and I am happy to be able now to do more than detest them. I despise them." "What shall we do?" asked Louise. "What shall we do?" "Yes. Why, the same we had intended doing 3 days since, set off." "What? Although you are not now going to be married, you intend still?" "Listen, Louise, I hate this life of the fashionable world, always ordered, measured, ruled, like our music paper. What I have always wished for, desired, and coveted, is the life of an artist, free and independent, relying only on my own resources, and accountable only to myself. Remain here? What for? That they may try, a month hence, to marry me again. And to whom? Debray, perhaps, as it was once proposed. No, Louise, no. This evening's adventure will serve for my excuse. I did not seek one, I did not ask for one. God sends me this, and I hail it joyfully. How strong and courageous you are," said the fair, frail girl to her brunette companion. "Did you not yet know me? Come, Louise, let us talk of our affairs. The postchaise was happily bought 3 days since. Have you had it sent where we are to go for it?" "Yes. Our passport. Here it is." And Eugénie, with her usual precision, opened a printed paper and read, Léon d'Armilly, 20 years of age, profession artist, hair black, eyes black, traveling with his sister. Capital! How did you get this passport? When I went to ask de Monte Cristo for letters to the directors of the theaters at Rome and Naples, I expressed my fears of traveling as a woman. He perfectly understood them and undertook to procure for me a man's passport, and 2 days after I received this, to which I have added with my own hand, traveling with his sister. 50035 Well, said Eugénie cheerfully, we have then only to pack up our trunks. We shall start the evening of the signing of the contract instead of the evening of the wedding, that is all. But consider the matter seriously, Eugénie. Oh, I am done with considering. I am tired of hearing only of market reports, of the end of the month, of the rise and fall of Spanish funds, of Haitian bonds. Instead of that, Louise, do you understand? Air, liberty, melody of birds, plains of Lombardy, Venetian canals, Roman palaces, the Bay of Naples. How much have we, Louise? The young girl to whom this question was addressed drew from an inlaid secrétaire a small portfolio with a lock, in which she counted 23 banknotes. 23,000 francs, said she. And as much, at least, in pearls, diamonds, and jewels, said Eugénie. We are rich. With 45,000 francs we can live like princesses for 2 years, and comfortably for 4. But before 6 months, you with your music and I with my voice, we shall double our capital. Come, you shall take charge of the money, I of the jewel box, so that if one of us had the misfortune to lose her treasure, the other would still have hers left. Now, the portmanteau. Let us make haste. The portmanteau. Stop, said Louise, going to listen at Madame Danglars' door. What do you fear? That we may be discovered. The door is locked. They may tell us to open it. They may if they like, but we will not. You are a perfect Amazon, Eugenie. And the two young girls began to heap into a trunk all the things they thought they should require. There now, said Eugenie. While I change my costume, do you lock the portmanteau? Louise pressed with all the strength of her little hands on the top of the portmanteau. But I cannot, said she. I am not strong enough. Do you shut it? Ah, you do well to ask, said Eugenie, laughing. I forgot that I was Hercules and you only the pale Omphale. And the young girl, kneeling on the top, pressed the two parts of the portmanteau together, and Mademoiselle d'Armilly passed the bolt of the padlock through. When this was done, Eugenie opened a drawer of which she kept the key, and took from it a wadded violet silk traveling cloak. Here, said she. You see I have thought of everything. With this cloak you will not be cold. But you! Oh, I am never cold, you know. Besides, with these men's clothes. Will you dress here? Certainly. Shall you have time? Do not be uneasy, you little coward. All our servants are busy, discussing the grand affair. Besides, what is there astonishing, when you think of the grief I ought to be in, that I shut myself up? Tell me. No, truly. You comfort me. Come and help me. From the same drawer she took a man's complete costume, from the boots to the coat, and a provision of linen, where there was nothing superfluous, but every requisite. Then, with a promptitude which indicated that this was not the first time she had amused herself by adopting the garb of the opposite sex, Eugenie drew on the boots and pantaloons, tied her cravat, buttoned her waistcoat up to the throat, and put on a coat which admirably fitted her beautiful figure. Oh, that is very good, indeed, it is very good, said Louise, looking at her with admiration. But that beautiful black hair, those magnificent braids, which made all the ladies sigh with envy. Will they go under a man's hat like the one I see down there? You shall see, said Eugenie, and with her left hand seizing the thick mass, which her long fingers could scarcely grasp, she took in her right hand a pair of long scissors, and soon the steel met through the rich and splendid hair, which fell in a cluster at her feet as she leaned back to keep it from her coat. Then she grasped the front hair, which she also cut off, without expressing the least regret. On the contrary, her eyes sparkled with greater pleasure than usual under her ebony eyebrows. Oh, the magnificent hair, said Louise with regret. And am I not 100 times better thus? Cried Eugenie, smoothing the scattered curls of her hair, which had now quite a masculine appearance. And do you not think me handsomer so? Oh, you are beautiful, always beautiful, cried Louise. Now, where are you going? To Brussels, if you like. It is the nearest frontier. We can go to Brussels, Liège, Aix-la-Chapelle. Then up the Rhine to Strasbourg. We will cross Switzerland, and go down into Italy by the St. Gothard. Will that do? Yes. What are you looking at? I am looking at you. Indeed, you are adorable like that. One would say you were carrying me off. And they would be right, pardieu. Oh, I think you swore, Eugenie. And the two young girls, whom everyone might have thought plunged in grief, the one on her own account, the other from interest in her friend, burst out laughing, as they cleared away every visible trace of the disorder which had naturally accompanied the preparations for their escape. Then, having blown out the lights, the two fugitives, looking and listening eagerly, with outstretched necks, opened the door of a dressing-room which led by a side staircase down to the yard, Eugenie going first and holding with one arm the portmanteau, which by the opposite handle Mademoiselle d'Armilly scarcely raised with both hands. The yard was empty. The clock was striking 12. The porter was not yet gone to bed. Eugenie approached softly, and saw the old man sleeping soundly in an armchair in his lodge. She returned to Louise, took up the portmanteau, which she had placed for a moment on the ground, and they reached the archway under the shadow of the wall. Eugenie concealed Louise in an angle of the gateway, so that if the porter chanced to awake he might see but one person. Then placing herself in the full light of the lamp which lit the yard, "Gate!" cried she, with her finest contralto voice, and rapping at the window. The porter got up as Eugenie expected, and even advanced some steps to recognize the person who was going out, but seeing a young man striking his boot impatiently with his riding whip, he opened it immediately. Louise slid through the half-open gate like a snake and bounded lightly forward. Eugenie, apparently calm, although in all probability her heart beat somewhat faster than usual, went out in her turn. A porter was passing and they gave him the portmanteau. Then the two young girls, having told him to take it to number 36, Rue de la Victoire, walked behind this man, whose presence comforted Louise. As for Eugenie, she was as strong as a Judith or a Delilah. They arrived at the appointed spot. Eugenie ordered the porter to put down the portmanteau, gave him some pieces of money, and having rapped at the shutter sent him away. The shutter where Eugenie had rapped was that of a little laundress, who had been previously warned, and was not yet gone to bed. She opened the door. "Mademoiselle," said Eugenie, "let the porter get the post-chaise from the coach-house and fetch some post-horses from the hotel. Here are 5 francs for his trouble." "Indeed," said Louise. "I admire you, and I could almost say respect you." The laundress looked on in astonishment, but as she had been promised 20 louis, she made no remark. In a quarter of an hour the porter returned with a post-boy and horses, which were harnessed, and put in the post-chaise in a minute, while the porter fastened the portmanteau on with the assistance of a cord and strap. "Here is the passport," said the postilion. "Which way are we going, young gentleman?" "To Fontainebleau," replied Eugenie with an almost masculine voice. "What do you say?" said Louise. "I am giving them the slip," said Eugenie. "This woman to whom we have given 20 louis may betray us for 40. We will soon alter our direction." And the young girl jumped into the britska, which was admirably arranged for sleeping in, without scarcely touching the step. "You are always right," said the music teacher, seating herself by the side of her friend. A quarter of an hour afterwards the postilion, having been put in the right road, passed with a crack of his whip through the gateway of the Barrière Saint-Martin. "Ah," said Louise, breathing freely, "here we are out of Paris." "Yes, my dear, the abduction is an accomplished fact," replied Eugenie. "Yes, and without violence," said Louise. "I shall bring that forward as an extenuating circumstance," replied Eugenie. These words were lost in the noise which the carriage made in rolling over the pavement of La Villette. Danglars no longer had a daughter. Chapter 98. The Bell and Bottle Tavern. And now let us leave Mademoiselle Danglars and her friend pursuing their way to Brussels, and return to poor Andrea Cavalcanti, so inopportunely interrupted in his rise to fortune. Notwithstanding his youth, Master Andrea was a very skillful and intelligent boy. We have seen that on the first rumor which reached the salon he had gradually approached the door, and crossing 2 or 3 rooms at last disappeared. But we have forgotten to mention one circumstance, which nevertheless ought not to be omitted. In one of the rooms he crossed, the trousseau of the bride-elect was on exhibition. There were caskets of diamonds, cashmere shawls, Valenciennes lace, English veils, and in fact all the tempting things, the bare mention of which makes the hearts of young girls bound with joy, and which is called the corbel. 22 Now, in passing through this room, Andrea proved himself not only to be clever and intelligent, but also provident, for he helped himself to the most valuable of the ornaments before him. Furnished with this plunder, Andrea leaped with a lighter heart from the window, intending to slip through the hands of the gendarmes. Tall and well-proportioned as an ancient gladiator and muscular as a Spartan, he walked for a quarter of an hour without knowing where to direct his steps, actuated by the sole idea of getting away from the spot where if he lingered he knew that he would surely be taken. Having passed through the Rue du Mont Blanc, guided by the instinct which leads thieves always to take the safest path, he found himself at the end of the Rue Lafayette. There he stopped, breathless and panting. He was quite alone. On one side was the vast wilderness of the Saint-Lazare, on the other, Paris enshrouded in darkness. "Am I to be captured?" he cried. "No, not if I can use more activity than my enemies. My safety is now a mere question of speed." At this moment he saw a cab at the top of the Faubourg Poissonnière. The dull driver, smoking his pipe, was plodding along toward the limits of the Faubourg Saint-Denis, where no doubt he ordinarily had his station. "Ho, friend!" said Benedetto. "What do you want, sir?" asked the driver. "Is your horse tired?" "Tired? Oh, yes, tired enough. He has done nothing the whole of this blessed day, for wretched fares and 20 sous over, making in all 7 francs, are all that I have earned, and I ought to take 10 to the owner. Will you add these 20 francs to the 7 you have? With pleasure, sir. 20 francs are not to be despised. Tell me what I am to do for this. A very easy thing, if your horse isn't tired. I tell you he'll go like the wind. Only tell me which way to drive. Towards the Louvres. Ah, I know the way. You get good sweetened rum over there. Exactly so. I merely wish to overtake one of my friends, with whom I am going to hunt tomorrow at Chapelle-en-Serval. He should have waited for me here with a cabriolet till 11:30. It is 12, and, tired of waiting, he must have gone on. It is likely. Well, will you try and overtake him? Nothing I should like better. If you do not overtake him before we reach Bourget, you shall have 20 francs. If not before Louvres, 30. And if we do overtake him? 40, said Andrea, after a moment's hesitation, at the end of which he remembered that he might safely promise. That's all right, said the man. Hop in and we're off. Oh, PLA. Andrea got into the cab, which passed rapidly through the Faubourg Saint-Denis, along the Faubourg Saint-Martin, crossed the barrier, and threaded its way through the interminable Villette. They never overtook the chimerical friend, yet Andrea frequently inquired of people on foot whom he passed and at the inns which were not yet closed, for a green cabriolet and bay horse, and as there are a great many cabriolets to be seen on the road to the Low Countries, and as 9/10 of them are green, the inquiries increased at every step. Everyone had just seen it pass. It was only 500, 200, 100 steps in advance. At length they reached it, but it was not the friend. Once the cab was also passed by a calash rapidly whirled along by 2 post-horses. Ah, said Cavalcanti to himself, if I only had that Britska, those 2 good post-horses, and above all the passport that carries them on, and he sighed deeply. The calash contained Mademoiselle Danglars and Mademoiselle d'Armilly. Hurry, hurry, said Andrea. We must overtake him soon, and the poor horse resumed the desperate gallop it had kept up since leaving the barrier, and arrived steaming at Louvres. Certainly, said Andrea. I shall not overtake my friend, but I shall kill your horse, therefore I had better stop. Here are 30 francs. I will sleep at the Cheval Rouge, and will secure a place in the first coach. Good night, friend. And Andrea, after placing 6 pieces of 5 francs each in the man's hand, leaped lightly on to the pathway. The cabman joyfully pocketed the sum, and turned back on his road to Paris. Andrea pretended to go towards the hotel of the Cheval Rouge, but after leaning an instant against the door, and hearing the last sound of the cab, which was disappearing from view, he went on his road, and with a lusty stride soon traversed the space of 2 leagues. Then he rested. He must be near Chapelle-en-Serval, where he pretended to be going. It was not fatigue that stayed Andrea here. It was that he might form some resolution, adopt some plan. It would be impossible to make use of a diligence, equally so to engage post-horses. To travel either way a passport was necessary. It was still more impossible to remain in the department of the Oise, one of the most open and strictly guarded in France. This was quite out of the question, especially to a man like Andrea, perfectly conversant with criminal matters, that he sat down by the side of the moat, buried his face in his hands and reflected. 10 minutes after he raised his head, his resolution was made. He threw some dust over the topcoat, which he had found time to unhook from the antechamber and button over his ball costume, and going to Chapelle-en-Serval he knocked loudly at the door of the only inn in the place. The host opened. My friend, said Andrea, I was coming from Mortefontaine to Senlis when my horse, which is a troublesome creature, stumbled and threw me. I must reach Compiègne tonight, or I shall cause deep anxiety to my family. Could you let me hire a horse of you? An innkeeper has always a horse to let, whether it be good or bad. The host called the stable boy, and ordered him to saddle Leblanc. Then he awoke his son, a child of 7 years, whom he ordered to ride before the gentleman and bring back the horse. Andrea gave the innkeeper 20 francs, and in taking them from his pocket dropped a visiting card. This belonged to one of his friends at the Café de Paris, so that the innkeeper, picking it up after Andrea had left, was convinced that he had let his horse to the Count of Monte 25 Rue Saint-Dominique, that being the name and address on the card. Leblanc was not a fast animal, but he kept up an easy, steady pace. In 3 hours and a half Andrea had traversed the 9 leagues which separated him from Compiègne, and 4 o'clock struck as he reached the place where the coaches stop. There is an excellent tavern at Compiègne, well remembered by those who have ever been there. Andrea, who had often stayed there in his rides about Paris, recollected the Bell and Bottle Inn. He turned around, saw the sign by the light of a reflected lamp, and having dismissed the child, giving him all the small coin he had about him, he began knocking at the door, very reasonably concluding that having now 3 or 4 hours before him, he had best fortify himself against the fatigues of the morrow by a sound sleep and a good supper. A waiter opened the door. "My friend," said Andrea, "I have been dining at Saint Genix-Bois, and expected to catch the coach which passes by at midnight, but like a fool I have lost my way, and have been walking for the last 4 hours in the forest. Show me into one of those pretty little rooms which overlook the court, and bring me a cold fowl and a bottle of Bordeaux." The waiter had no suspicions. Andrea spoke with perfect composure. He had a cigar in his mouth, and his hands in the pocket of his top coat. His clothes were fashionably made, his chin smooth, his boots irreproachable. He looked merely as if he had stayed out very late, that was all. While the waiter was preparing his room, the hostess arose. Andrea assumed his most charming smile, and asked if he could have number 3, which he had occupied on his last stay at Compiègne. Unfortunately, number 3 was engaged by a young man who was traveling with his sister. Andrea appeared in despair, but consoled himself when the hostess assured him that number 7, prepared for him, was situated precisely the same as number 3, and while warming his feet and chatting about the last races at Chantilly, he waited until they announced his room to be ready. Andrea had not spoken without cause of the pretty rooms looking out upon the court of the Belle Hotel, which with its triple galleries like those of a theatre, with the jessamine and clematis twining round the light columns, forms one of the prettiest entrances to an inn that you can imagine. The fowl was tender, the wine old, the fire clear and sparkling, and Andrea was surprised to find himself eating with as good an appetite as though nothing had happened. Then he went to bed and almost immediately fell into that deep sleep which is sure to visit men of 20 years of age, even when they are torn with remorse. Now, here we are obliged to own that Andrea ought to have felt remorse, but that he did not. This was the plan which had appealed to him to afford the best chance of his security. Before daybreak he would awake, leave the inn after rigorously paying his bill, and reaching the forest, he would, under pretense of making studies in painting, test the hospitality of some peasants, procure himself the dress of a woodcutter and a hatchet, casting off the lion's skin to assume that of the woodman. Then, with his hands covered with dirt, his hair darkened by means of a leaden comb, his complexion embrowned with a preparation for which one of his old comrades had given him the recipe, he intended, by following the wooded districts, to reach the nearest frontier, walking by night and sleeping in the day in the forests and quarries, and only entering inhabited regions to buy a loaf from time to time. Once past the frontier, Andrea proposed making money of his diamonds, and by uniting the proceeds to 10 banknotes he always carried about with him in case of accident, he would then find himself possessor of about 50,000 livres, which he philosophically considered as no very deplorable condition after all. Moreover, he reckoned much on the interest of the Danglars to hush up the rumor of their own misadventures. These were the reasons which, added to the fatigue, caused Andrea to sleep so soundly. In order that he might wake early, he did not close the shutters, but contented himself with bolting the door and placing on the table an unclasped and long-pointed knife, whose temper he well knew, and which was never absent from him. About 7 in the morning Andrea was awakened by a ray of sunlight, which played, warm and brilliant, upon his face. In all well-organized brains, the predominating idea, and there always is one, is sure to be the last thought before sleeping, and the first upon waking in the morning. Andrea had scarcely opened his eyes when his predominating idea presented itself, and whispered in his ear that he had slept too long. He jumped out of bed and ran to the window. A gendarme was crossing the court. A gendarme is one of the most striking objects in the world, even to a man void of uneasiness. But for one who has a timid conscience, and with good cause too, the yellow, blue, and white uniform is really very alarming. "Why is that gendarme there?" asked Andrea of himself. Then, all at once, he replied, with that logic which the reader has, doubtless, remarked in him, "There is nothing astonishing in seeing a gendarme at an inn. Instead of being astonished, let me dress myself." And the youth dressed himself with a facility his valet-de-chambre had failed to rob him of during the 2 months of fashionable life he had led in Paris. "Now then," said Andrea while dressing himself, "I'll wait till he leaves and then I'll slip away." 500 for 7 man. Saying this, Andrea, who had now put on his boots and cravat, stole gently to the window and a second time lifted up the muslin curtain. Not only was the first gendarme still there, but the young man now perceived a second yellow, blue, and white uniform at the foot of the staircase, the only one by which he could descend, while a third, on horseback, holding a musket in his fist, was posted as a sentinel at the great street door which alone afforded the means of egress. The appearance of the third gendarme settled the matter, for a crowd of curious loungers was extended before him, effectually blocking the entrance to the hotel. "They're after me," was Andrea's first thought. Diable! A pallor overspread the young man's forehead, and he looked around him with anxiety. His room, like all those on the same floor, had but one outlet to the gallery in the sight of everybody. "I am lost," was his second thought, and, indeed, for a man in Andrea's situation, an arrest meant the assizes, trial, and death without mercy or delay. For a moment he convulsively pressed his head within his hands, and during that brief period he became nearly mad with terror. But soon a ray of hope glimmered in the multitude of thoughts which bewildered his mind, and a faint smile played upon his white lips and pallid cheeks. He looked around and saw the objects of his search upon the chimney-piece. They were a pen, ink, and paper. With forced composure he dipped the pen in the ink and wrote the following lines upon a sheet of paper. "I have no money to pay my bill, but I am not a dishonest man. I leave behind me as a pledge this pin, worth 10 times the amount. I shall be excused for leaving at daybreak, for I was ashamed." He then drew the pin from his cravat and placed it on the paper. This done, instead of leaving the door fastened, he drew back the bolts and even placed the door ajar, as though he had left the room, forgetting to close it, and slipping into the chimney like a man accustomed to that kind of gymnastic exercise. After replacing the chimney board, which represented Achilles with Deidamia, and effacing the very marks of his feet upon the ashes, he commenced climbing the hollow tunnel, which afforded him the only means of escape left at this precise time. The first gendarme Andrea had noticed walked upstairs, preceded by the commissary of police, and supported by the second gendarme who guarded the staircase and was himself reinforced by the one stationed at the door. Andrea was indebted for this visit to the following circumstances. At daybreak, the telegraphs were set at work in all directions, and almost immediately the authorities in every district had exerted their utmost endeavors to arrest the murderer of Catullus. Compiègne, that royal residence and fortified town, is well furnished with authorities, gendarmes, and commissaries of police. They therefore began operations as soon as the telegraphic dispatch arrived, and the Bell and Bottle being the best-known hotel in the town, they had naturally directed their first inquiries there. Now, besides the reports of the sentinels guarding the Hôtel de Ville, which is next door to the Bell and Bottle, it had been stated by others that a number of travelers had arrived during the night. The sentinel, who was relieved at 6 o'clock in the morning, remembered perfectly that, just as he was taking his post a few minutes past 4, a young man arrived on horseback with a little boy before him. The young man, having dismissed the boy and horse, knocked at the door of the hotel, which was opened, and again closed after his entrance. This late arrival had attracted much suspicion, and the young man being no other than Andrea, the commissary and gendarme, who was a brigadier, directed their steps towards his room. They found the door ajar. "Oh," said the brigadier, who thoroughly understood the trick. "A bad sign to find the door open. I would rather find it triply bolted." And, indeed, the little note and pin upon the table confirmed, or rather corroborated, the sad truth. Andrea had fled. We say corroborated because the brigadier was too experienced to be convinced by a single proof. He glanced around, looked in the bed, shook the curtains, opened the closets, and finally stopped at the chimney. Andrea had taken the precaution to leave no traces of his feet in the ashes, but still it was an outlet, and in this light was not to be passed over without serious investigation. The brigadier sent for some sticks and straw, and having filled the chimney with them, set a light to it. The fire crackled, and the smoke ascended like the dull vapor from a volcano. But still no prisoner fell down, as they expected. The fact was that Andrea, at war with society ever since his youth, was quite as deep as a gendarme. Even though he were advanced to the rank of brigadier, and quite prepared for the fire, He had climbed out on the roof and was crouching down against the chimney pots. At one time he thought he was saved, for he heard the brigadier exclaim in a loud voice to the two gendarmes, "He is not here!" But venturing to peep, he perceived that the latter, instead of retiring, as might have been reasonably expected upon this announcement, were watching with increased attention that it was now his turn to look about him. The Hôtel de Ville, a massive 16th-century building, was on his right. Anyone could descend from the openings in the tower and examine every corner of the roof below, and Andrea expected momentarily to see the head of a gendarme appear at one of these openings. If once discovered, he knew he would be lost, for the roof afforded no chance of escape. He therefore resolved to descend, not through the same chimney by which he had come up, but by a similar one conducting to another room. That he looked around for a chimney from which no smoke issued, and having reached it, he disappeared through the orifice without being seen by anyone. At the same minute, one of the little windows of the Hôtel de Ville was thrown open, and the head of a gendarme appeared. For an instant it remained motionless as one of the stone decorations of the building. Then, after a long sigh of disappointment, the head disappeared. The brigadier, calm and dignified as the law he represented, passed through the crowd without answering the 1,000 questions addressed to him, and re-entered the hotel. "Well?" asked the two gendarmes. "Well, my boys," said the brigadier. "The brigand must really have escaped early this morning, but we will send to the Villers-Cotterettes and Noyen roads, and search the forest when we shall catch him, no doubt." The honorable functionary had scarcely expressed himself thus, in that intonation which is peculiar to brigadiers of the gendarmerie, when a loud scream, accompanied by the violent ringing of a bell, resounded through the court of the hotel. "Ah, what is that?" cried the brigadier. "Some traveler seems impatient," said the host. "What number was it that rang?" "Number 3. Run, waiter." At this moment the screams and ringing were redoubled. "Aha!" said the brigadier, stopping the servant. "The person who is ringing appears to want something more than a waiter. We will attend upon him with a gendarme. Who occupies number 3? "The little fellow who arrived last night in a post-chaise with his sister, and who asked for an apartment with 2 beds. The bell here rang for the 3rd time with another shriek of anguish. "Follow me, Mr. Commissary," said the brigadier. "Tread in my steps." "Wait an instant," said the host. "Number 3 has 2 staircases, inside and outside." "Good," said the brigadier. "I will take charge of the inside one. Are the carbines loaded?" "Yes, brigadier." "Well, you guard the exterior, and if he attempts to fly, fire upon him. He must be a great criminal, from what the telegraph says." The brigadier, followed by the commissary, disappeared by the inside staircase, accompanied by the noise which his assertions respecting Andrea had excited in the crowd. This is what had happened. Andrea had very cleverly managed to descend 2/3 of the chimney, but then his foot slipped, and notwithstanding his endeavors, he came into the room with more speed and noise than he intended. It would have signified little had the room been empty, but unfortunately it was occupied. 2 ladies, sleeping in one bed, were awakened by the noise, and fixing their eyes upon the spot whence the sound proceeded, they saw a man. One of these ladies, the fair one, uttered those terrible shrieks which resounded through the house, while the other, rushing to the bell-rope, rang with all her strength. Andrea, as we can see, was surrounded by misfortune. "For pity's sake," he cried, pale and bewildered, without seeing whom he was addressing. "For pity's sake, do not call assistance. Save me. I will not harm you." "Andrea, the murderer!" cried one of the ladies. "Eugenie, Mademoiselle Danglars!" exclaimed Andrea, stupefied. "Help! Help!" cried Mademoiselle d'Armilly, taking the bell from her companion's hand, and ringing it yet more violently. "Save me! I am pursued!" said Andrea, clasping his hands. "For pity! For mercy's sake, do not deliver me up." "It is too late, they are coming," said Eugenie. "Well, conceal me somewhere. You can say you were needlessly alarmed. You can turn their suspicions and save my life." The 2 ladies, pressing closely to one another, and drawing the bedclothes tightly around them, remained silent to this supplicating voice, repugnance and fear taking possession of their minds. "Well, be it so," at length said Eugenie. "Return by the same road you came, and we will say nothing about you, unhappy wretch. Here he is. "Here he is!" cried a voice from the landing. "Here he is! I see him!" The brigadier had put his eye to the keyhole and had discovered Andrea in a posture of entreaty. A violent blow from the butt end of the musket burst open the lock, 2 more forced out the bolts, and the broken door fell in. Andrea ran to the other door, leading to the gallery, ready to rush out. But he was stopped short, and he stood with his body a little thrown back, pale, and with the useless knife in his clenched hand. "Fly, then!" cried Mademoiselle d'Armilly, whose pity returned as her fears diminished. "Fly, or kill yourself," said Eugenie, in a tone which a Vestal in the amphitheater would have used, when urging the victorious gladiator to finish his vanquished adversary. Andrea shuddered, and looked on the young girl with an expression which proved how little he understood such ferocious honor. "Kill myself?" he cried, throwing down his knife. "Why should I do so?" "Why, you said," answered Mademoiselle Danglars, "that you would be condemned to die like the worst criminals." "Bah!" said Cavalcanti, crossing his arms. "One has friends." The brigadier advanced to him, sword in hand. "Come, come," said Andrea. "Sheathe your sword, my fine fellow. There is no occasion to make such a fuss, since I give myself up." And he held out his hands to be manacled. The 2 girls looked with horror upon this shameful metamorphosis, the man of the world shaking off his covering and appearing as a galley slave. Andrea turned towards them, and with an impertinent smile asked, "Have you any message for your father, Mademoiselle Danglars? For in all probability I shall return to Paris?" Eugenie covered her face with her hands. "Oh, oh," said Andrea. "You need not be ashamed, even though you did post after me. Was I not nearly your husband?" And with this raillery Andrea went out, leaving the 2 girls a prey to their own feelings of shame and to the comments of the crowd. An hour after they stepped into their calash, both dressed in feminine attire. The gate of the hotel had been closed to screen them from sight, but they were forced, when the door was open, to pass through a throng of curious glances and whispering voices. Eugenie closed her eyes. But though she could not see, she could hear, and the sneers of the crowd reached her in the carriage. "Oh, why is not the world a wilderness?" she exclaimed, throwing herself into the arms of Mademoiselle d'Armilly, her eyes sparkling with the same kind of rage which made Nero wish that the Roman world had but one neck, that he might sever it at a single blow. The next day they stopped at the Hôtel de Flandre at Brussels. The same evening Andrea was incarcerated in the conciergerie. Chapter 99. The law. We have seen how quietly Mademoiselle Danglars and Mademoiselle d'Armilly accomplished their transformation in flight. The fact being that everyone was too much occupied in his or her own affairs to think of theirs. We will leave the banker contemplating the enormous magnitude of his debt before the phantom of bankruptcy, and follow the Baroness, who, after being momentarily crushed under the weight of the blow which had struck her, had gone to seek her usual adviser, Lucien Debray. The Baroness had looked forward to this marriage as a means of ridding her of a guardianship which, over a girl of Eugenie's character, could not fail to be rather a troublesome undertaking. For in the tacit relations which maintain the bond of family union, the mother, to maintain her ascendancy over her daughter, must never fail to be a model of wisdom and a type of perfection. Now, Madame Danglars feared Eugenie's sagacity and the influence of Mademoiselle d'Armilly. She had frequently observed the contemptuous expression with which her daughter looked upon Debray, an expression which seemed to imply that she understood all her mother's amorous and pecuniary relationships with the intimate secretary. Moreover, she saw that Eugenie detested Debray, not only because he was a source of dissension and scandal under the paternal roof, but because she had at once classed him in that catalogue of bipeds whom Plato endeavors to withdraw from the appellation of men, and whom Diogenes designated as animals upon 2 legs without feathers. Unfortunately, in this world of ours, each person views things through a certain medium, and so is prevented from seeing in the same light as others, and Madame Danglars, therefore, very much regretted that the marriage of Eugenie had not taken place, not only because the match was good, and likely to ensure the happiness of her child, but because it would also set her at liberty. She ran therefore to Debray, who, after having, like the rest of Paris, witnessed the contract scene and the scandal attending it, had retired in haste to his club, where he was chatting with some friends upon the events which served as a subject of conversation for 3/4 of that city, known as the capital of the world. At the precise time when Madame Danglars, dressed in black and concealed in a long veil, was ascending the stairs leading to Debray's apartments. Notwithstanding the assurances of the concierge that the young man was not at home, Debray was occupied in repelling the insinuations of a friend, who tried to persuade him that after the terrible scene which had just taken place he ought, as a friend of the family, to marry Mademoiselle Danglars and her 2 millions. Debray did not defend himself very warmly, for the idea had sometimes crossed his mind. Still, when he recollected the independent, proud spirit of Eugénie, he positively rejected it as utterly impossible, though the same thought again continually recurred and found a resting place in his heart. Tea, play, and the conversation, which had become interesting during the discussion of such serious affairs, lasted till 1 o'clock in the morning. Meanwhile Madame Danglars, veiled and uneasy, awaited the return of Debray in the little green room, seated between 2 baskets of flowers, which she had that morning sent, and which, it must be confessed, Debray had himself arranged and watered with so much care that his absence was half excused in the eyes of the poor woman. At 20 minutes to 12, Madame Danglars, tired of waiting, returned home. Women of a certain grade are like prosperous grisettes in one respect: they seldom return home after 12 o'clock. The Baroness returned to the hotel with as much caution as Eugénie used in leaving it. She ran lightly upstairs, and with an aching heart entered her apartment, contiguous, as we know, to that of Eugénie. She was fearful of exciting any remark, and believed firmly in her daughter's innocence and fidelity to the paternal roof. She listened at Eugénie's door, and hearing no sound tried to enter, but the bolts were in place. Madame Danglars then concluded that the young girl had been overcome with the terrible excitement of the evening, and had gone to bed and to sleep. She called the maid and questioned her. "Mademoiselle Eugénie," said the maid, "retired to her apartment with Mademoiselle d'Armilly. They then took tea together, after which they desired me to leave, saying that they needed me no longer." Since then the maid had been below, and like everyone else she thought the young ladies were in their own room. Madame Danglars, therefore, went to bed without a shadow of suspicion, and began to muse over the recent events. In proportion as her memory became clearer, the occurrences of the evening were revealed in their true light. What she had taken for confusion was a tumult. What she had regarded as something distressing was in reality a disgrace. And then the Baroness remembered that she had felt no pity for poor Mercédès, who had been afflicted with as severe a blow through her husband and son. "Eugénie," she said to herself, "is lost, and so are we. The affair, as it will be reported, will cover us with shame. For in a society such as our satire inflicts a painful and incurable wound. How fortunate that Eugénie is possessed of that strange character which has so often made me tremble." And her glance was turned towards heaven, where a mysterious providence disposes all things, and out of a fault, nay, even a vice, sometimes produces a blessing. And then her thoughts, cleaving through space like a bird in the air, rested on Cavalcanti. This Andrea was a wretch, a robber, an assassin, and yet his manners showed the effects of a sort of education, if not a complete one. He had been presented to the world with the appearance of an immense fortune, supported by an honorable name. How could she extricate herself from this labyrinth? To whom would she apply to help her out of this painful situation? Debray, to whom she had run, with the first instinct of a woman towards the man she loves, and who yet betrays her. Debray could but give her advice. She must apply to someone more powerful than he. The Baroness then thought of M. de Villefort. It was M. de Villefort who had remorselessly brought misfortune into her family, as though they had been strangers. But no, on reflection, the procureur was not a merciless man, and it was not the magistrate, slave to his duties, but the friend, the loyal friend, who roughly but firmly cut into the very core of the corruption. It was not the executioner, but the surgeon, who wished to withdraw the honor of Danglars from ignominious association with the disgraced young man they had presented to the world as their son-in-law. And since Villefort, the friend of Danglars, had acted in this way, no one could suppose that he had been previously acquainted with, or had lent himself to, any of Andrea's intrigues. Villefort's conduct, therefore, upon reflection, appeared to the Baroness as if shaped for their mutual advantage. But the inflexibility of the procureur should stop there. She would see him the next day, and if she could not make him fail in his duties as a magistrate, she would, at least, obtain all the indulgence he could allow. She would invoke the past, recall old recollections. She would supplicate him by the remembrance of guilty, yet happy days. M. De Villefort would stifle the affair. He had only to turn his eyes on one side and allow Andrea to fly and follow up the crime under that shadow of guilt called contempt of court. And after this reasoning she slept easily. At 9 o'clock next morning she arose, and without ringing for her maid or giving the least sign of her activity, she dressed herself in the same simple style as on the previous night. Then running downstairs, she left the hotel, walked to the Rue de Provence, called a cab, and drove to M. de Villefort's house. For the last month this wretched house had presented the gloomy appearance of a lazaretto infected with the plague. Some of the apartments were closed within and without. The shutters were only open to admit a minute's air, showing the scared face of a footman, and immediately afterwards the window would be closed, like a gravestone falling on a sepulchre, and the neighbors would say to each other in a low voice, "Will there be another funeral today at the procureur's house?" Madame Danglars involuntarily shuddered at the desolate aspect of the mansion. Descending from the cab, she approached the door with trembling knees and rang the bell. 3 times did the bell ring with a dull, heavy sound, seeming to participate in the general sadness, before the concierge appeared and peeped through the door, which he opened just wide enough to allow his words to be heard. He saw a lady, a fashionable, elegantly dressed lady, and yet the door remained almost closed. "Do you intend opening the door?" said the Baroness. "First, madam, who are you?" "Who am I? You know me well enough." "We no longer know anyone, madam." "You must be mad, my friend," said the Baroness. "Where do you come from?" "Oh, this is too much. Madam, these are my orders." "Excuse me. Your name?" "The Baroness Danglars. You have seen me 20 times. "Possibly, madam. And now, what do you want?" "Oh, how extraordinary. I shall complain to M. de Villefort of the impertinence of his servants." "Madam, this is precaution, not impertinence. No one enters here without an order from M. d'Avrigny, or without speaking to the procureur." "Well, I have business with the procureur." "Is it pressing business?" "You can imagine so, since I have not even brought my carriage out yet. But enough of this. Here is my card. Take it to your master." "Madame will await my return?" "Yes, go." The concierge closed the door, leaving Madame Danglars in the street. She had not long to wait. Directly afterwards the door was opened wide enough to admit her, and when she had passed through it was again shut. Without losing sight of her for an instant, the concierge took a whistle from his pocket as soon as they entered the court, and blew it. The valet de chambre appeared on the doorsteps. "You will excuse this poor fellow, madame," he said as he preceded the Baroness, "but his orders are precise, and M. de Villefort begged me to tell you that he could not act otherwise." In the court, showing his merchandise, was a tradesman who had been admitted with the same precautions. The Baroness ascended the steps. She felt herself strongly infected with the sadness which seemed to magnify her own, and still guided by the valet de chambre, who never lost sight of her for an instant, she was introduced to the magistrate's study. Preoccupied as Madame Danglars had been with the object of her visit, the treatment she had received from these underlings appeared to her so insulting that she began by complaining of it. But Villefort, raising his head, bowed down by grief, looked up at her with so sad a smile that her complaints died upon her lips. "Forgive my servants," he said. "For a terror I cannot blame them for. From being suspected, they have become suspicious." Madame Danglars had often heard of the terror to which the magistrate alluded, but without the evidence of her own eyesight she could never have believed that the sentiment had been carried so far. "You too, then, are unhappy?" she said. "Yes, madam," replied the magistrate. "Then you pity me?" "Sincerely, madam." "And you understand what brings me here? You wish to speak to me about the circumstance which has just happened?" "Yes, sir." "A fearful misfortune." "You mean a mischance." "A mischance?" repeated the Baroness. "Alas, madam," said the procureur with his imperturbable calmness of manner, "I consider those alone misfortunes which are irreparable." "And do you suppose this will be forgotten?" "Everything will be forgotten, madam," said Villefort. "Your daughter will be married tomorrow, if not today, in a week, if not tomorrow, and I do not think you can regret the intended husband of your daughter." Madame Danglars gazed on Villefort, stupefied to find him so almost insultingly calm. "Am I come to a friend?" she asked in a tone full of mournful dignity. You know that you are, madame, said Villefort, whose pale cheeks became slightly flushed as he gave her the assurance. And truly this assurance carried him back to different events from those now occupying the Baroness and him. Well, then, be more affectionate, my dear Villefort, said the Baroness. Speak to me not as a magistrate, but as a friend, and when I am in bitter anguish of spirit, do not tell me that I ought to be gay. Villefort bowed. When I hear misfortunes named, madame, he said, I have within the last few months contracted the bad habit of thinking of my own, and then I cannot help drawing up an egotistical parallel in my mind. That is the reason that by the side of my misfortunes yours appear to me mere mischances. That is why my dreadful position makes yours appear enviable. But this annoys you. Let us change the subject. You were saying, madame? I came to ask you, my friend, said the Baroness. What will be done with this impostor? Impostor? Repeated Villefort. Certainly, madame, you appear to extenuate some cases and exaggerate others. Impostor indeed. Andrea Cavalcanti, or rather Benedetto, is nothing more nor less than an assassin. Sir, I do not deny the justice of your correction, but the more severely you arm yourself against that unfortunate man, the more deeply will you strike our family. Come, forget him for a moment, and instead of pursuing him, let him go. You are too late, madam. The orders are issued. Well, should he be arrested? Do they think they will arrest him? I hope so. If they should arrest him, I know that sometimes prisons afford means of escape. Will you leave him in prison? The procureur shook his head. At least keep him there till my daughter be married. Impossible, madam. Justice has its formalities. What, even for me? Said the Baroness, half jesting, half in earnest. For all, even for myself among the rest, replied Villefort. 50063 Ah! Exclaimed the Baroness, without expressing the ideas which the exclamation betrayed. Villefort looked at her with that piercing glance which reads the secrets of the heart. Yes, I know what you mean, he said. You refer to the terrible rumors spread abroad in the world, that the deaths which have kept me in mourning for the last 3 months, and from which Valentine has only escaped by a miracle, have not happened by natural means. I was not thinking of that, replied Madame Danglars quickly. Yes, you were thinking of it, and with justice. You could not help thinking of it, and saying to yourself, you, who pursue crime so vindicatively, answer now, why are there unpunished crimes in your dwelling? The Baroness became pale. You were saying this, were you not? Well, I own it. I will answer you. Villefort drew his armchair nearer to Madame Danglars. Then resting both hands upon his desk, he said in a voice more hollow than usual, there are crimes which remain unpunished because the criminals are unknown, and we might strike the innocent instead of the guilty. But when the culprits are discovered, Villefort here extended his hand toward a large crucifix placed opposite to his desk. When they are discovered, I swear to you, by all I hold most sacred, that whoever they may be they shall. D. Now, after the oath I have just taken, and which I will keep, madame, dare you ask for mercy for that wretch? But, sir, are you sure he is as guilty as they say? Listen, this is his description. Benedetto condemned at the age of 16, for 5 years to the galleys for forgery. He promised well, as you see. First a runaway, then an assassin. And who is this wretch? Who can tell? A vagabond, a Corsican. Has no one owned him? No one. His parents are unknown. But who was the man who brought him from Lucca? Another rascal like himself, perhaps his accomplice. The Baroness clasped her hands. Villefort, she exclaimed in her softest and most captivating manner. For heaven's sake, madame, said Villefort, with a firmness of expression not altogether free from harshness. For heaven's sake, do not ask pardon of me for a guilty wretch. What am I? The law. Has the law any eyes to witness your grief? Has the law ears to be melted by your sweet voice? Has the law a memory for all those soft recollections you endeavor to recall? No, madam. The law has commanded, and when it commands it strikes. You will tell me that I am a living being, and not a code, a man, and not a volume. Look at me, madam, look around me. Has mankind treated me as a brother? Have men loved me? Have they spared me? Has anyone shown the mercy towards me that you now ask at my hands? No, madam, they struck me, always struck me. 50065 woman, siren that you are, do you persist in fixing on me that fascinating eye, which reminds me that I ought to blush? Well, be it so. Let me blush for the faults you know, and perhaps for even more than those, but having sinned myself, it may be more deeply than others. I never rest till I have torn the disguises from my fellow creatures and found out their weaknesses. I have always found them, and more, I repeat it with joy, with triumph. I have always found some proof of human perversity or error. Every criminal I condemn seems to me living evidence that I am not a hideous exception to the rest. Alas, alas, alas! All the world is wicked. Let us therefore strike at wickedness. Villefort pronounced these last words with a feverish rage, which gave a ferocious eloquence to his words. But, said Madame Danglars, resolving to make a last effort, this young man, though a murderer, is an orphan, abandoned by everybody. So much the worse, or rather, so much the better. It has been so ordained that he may have none to weep his fate. But this is trampling on the weak, sir. The weakness of a murderer. His dishonor reflects upon us. Is not death in my house? Oh, sir, exclaimed the Baroness, you are without pity for others. Well, then, I tell you they will have no mercy on you. Be it so, said Villefort, raising his arms to heaven with a threatening gesture. At least, delay the trial till the next assizes. We shall then have 6 months before us. No, madame, said Villefort. Instructions have been given. There are yet 5 days left. 5 days are more than I require. Do you not think that I also long for forgetfulness? While working night and day, I sometimes lose all recollection of the past, and then I experience the same sort of happiness I can imagine the dead feel. Still, it is better than suffering. But, sir, he has fled. Let him escape. Inaction is a pardonable offense. I tell you it is too late. Early this morning the telegraph was employed, and at this very minute. Sir, said the valet de chambre, entering the room, a dragoon has brought this dispatch from the Minister of the Interior. Villefort seized the letter and hastily broke the seal. Madame Danglars trembled with fear. Villefort started with joy. Arrested, he exclaimed. He was taken at Compiègne, and all is over. Madame Danglars rose from her seat, pale and cold. Adieu, sir, she said. Adieu, madame, replied the king's attorney, as in an almost joyful manner he conducted her to the door. Then, turning to his desk, he said, striking the letter with the back of his right hand, Come, I had a forgery, 3 robberies, and 2 cases of arson. I only wanted a murder, and here it is. It will be a splendid session. Chapter 100. The apparition, as the procureur had told Madame Danglars. Valentine was not yet recovered. Bowed down with fatigue, she was indeed confined to her bed, and it was in her own room, and from the lips of Madame de Villefort, that she heard all the strange events we have related. We mean the flight of Eugenie and the arrest of Andrea Cavalcanti, or rather Benedetto, together with the accusation of murder pronounced against him. But Valentine was so weak that this recital scarcely produced the same effect it would have done had she been in her usual state of health. Indeed, her brain was only the seat of vague ideas, and confused forms, mingled with strange fancies, alone presented themselves before her eyes. During the daytime Valentine's perceptions remained tolerably clear, owing to the constant presence of M. Noirtier, who caused himself to be carried to his granddaughter's room, and watched her with his paternal tenderness. Villefort also, on his return from the law courts, frequently passed an hour or 2 with his father and child. At 6 o'clock. Villefort retired to his study at 8 m. D'Avrigny himself arrived, bringing the night draught prepared for the young girl, and then M. Noirtier was carried away. A nurse of the doctor's choice succeeded them, and never left till about 10 or 11 o'clock, when Valentine was asleep. As she went downstairs she gave the keys of Valentine's room to M. de Villefort, so that no one could reach the sick room excepting through that of Madame de Villefort and little Edward. Every morning Morel called on Noirtier to receive news of Valentine, and, extraordinary as it seemed, each day found him less uneasy. Certainly, though Valentine still labored under dreadful nervous excitement, she was better. and moreover, Monte Cristo had told him when, half distracted, he had rushed to the Count's house, that if she were not dead in 2 hours she would be saved. Now 4 days had elapsed, and Valentine still lived. The nervous excitement of which we speak pursued Valentine even in her sleep, or rather in that state of somnolence which succeeded her waking hours. It was then, in the silence of night, in the dim light shed from the alabaster lamp on the chimney-piece, that she saw the shadows pass and repass which hover over the bed of sickness, and fan the fever with their trembling wings. First she fancied she saw her stepmother threatening her, then Morrel stretched his arms towards her. Sometimes mere strangers, like the Count of Monte Cristo, came to visit her. Even the very furniture, in these moments of delirium, seemed to move, and this state lasted till about 3 o'clock in the morning, when a deep, heavy slumber overcame the young girl, from which she did not awake till daylight. On the evening of the day on which Valentine had learned of the flight of Eugenie and the arrest of Benedetto, Villefort having retired as well as Noirtier and d'Avrigny, her thoughts wandered in a confused maze, alternately reviewing her own situation and the events she had just heard. 11 o'clock had struck. The nurse, having placed the beverage prepared by the doctor within reach of the patient, and locked the door, was listening with terror to the comments of the servants in the kitchen, and storing her memory with all the horrible stories which had for some months past amused the occupants of the antechambers in the house of the king's attorney. Meanwhile an unexpected scene was passing in the room which had been so carefully locked. 10 minutes had elapsed since the nurse had left. Valentine, who for the last hour had been suffering from the fever which returned nightly, incapable of controlling her ideas, was forced to yield to the excitement which exhausted itself in producing and reproducing a succession and recurrence of the same fancies and images. The night lamp threw out countless rays, each resolving itself into some strange form to her disordered imagination, when suddenly by its flickering light Valentine thought she saw the door of her library, which was in the recess by the chimney-piece, open slowly, though she in vain listened for the sound of the hinges on which it turned. Any other time Valentine would have seized the silken bell-pull and summoned assistance, but nothing astonished her in her present situation. Her reason told her that all the visions she beheld were but the children of her imagination, and the conviction was strengthened by the fact that in the morning no traces remained of the nocturnal phantoms, who disappeared with the coming of daylight. From behind the door a human figure appeared, but the girl was too familiar with such apparitions to be alarmed, and therefore only stared, hoping to recognize Morrel. The figure advanced towards the bed and appeared to listen with profound attention. At this moment a ray of light glanced across the face of the midnight visitor. "It is not he," she murmured, and waited, in the assurance that this was but a dream, for the man to disappear or assume some other form. Still, she felt her pulse, and finding it throb violently she remembered that the best method of dispelling such illusions was to drink. For a draught of the beverage prepared by the doctor to allay her fever seemed to cause a reaction of the brain, and for a short time she suffered less. Valentine therefore reached her hand towards the glass, but as soon as her trembling arm left the bed the apparition advanced more quickly towards her, and approached the young girl so closely that she fancied she heard his breath, and felt the pressure of his hand. This time the illusion, or rather the reality, surpassed anything Valentine had before experienced. She began to believe herself really alive and awake, and the belief that her reason was this time not deceived made her shudder. The pressure she felt was evidently intended to arrest her arm, and she slowly withdrew it. Then the figure, from whom she could not detach her eyes, and who appeared more protecting than menacing, took the glass, and walking towards the night light held it up, as if to test its transparency. This did not seem sufficient. The man, or rather the ghost, for he trod so softly that no sound was heard, then poured out about a spoonful into the glass, and drank it. Valentine witnessed this scene with a sentiment of stupefaction. Every minute she had expected that it would vanish and give place to another vision. But the man, instead of dissolving like a shadow, again approached her, and said in an agitated voice, "Now you may drink." Valentine shuddered. It was the first time one of these visions had ever addressed her in a living voice, and she was about to utter an exclamation. The man placed his finger on her lips. "The Count of Monte Cristo!" she murmured. It was easy to see that no doubt now remained in the young girl's mind as to the reality of the scene. Her eyes started with terror, her hands trembled, and she rapidly drew the bedclothes closer to her. Still, the presence of Monte Cristo at such an hour, his mysterious, fanciful, and extraordinary entrance into her room through the wall, might well seem impossibilities to her shattered reason. "Do not call anyone. Do not be alarmed," said the Count. "Do not let a shade of suspicion or uneasiness remain in your breast. The man standing before you, Valentine, for this time it is no ghost, is nothing more than the tenderest father and the most respectful friend you could dream of." Valentine could not reply. The voice which indicated the real presence of a being in the room alarmed her so much that she feared to utter a syllable. Still the expression of her eyes seemed to inquire, "If your intentions are pure, why are you here?" The Count's marvelous sagacity understood all that was passing in the young girl's mind. "Listen to me," he said, "or rather look upon me. Look at my face, paler even than usual, and my eyes, red with weariness. For 4 days I have not closed them, for I have been constantly watching you, to protect and preserve you for Maximilian." The blood mounted rapidly to the cheeks of Valentine, for the name just announced by the Count dispelled all the fear with which his presence had inspired her. "Maximilian!" she exclaimed, and so sweet did the sound appear to her, that she repeated it. "Maximilian! Has he then owned all to you?" "Everything. He told me your life was his, and I have promised him that you shall live." "You have promised him that I shall live?" "Yes." "But, sir, you spoke of vigilance and protection. Are you a doctor?" "Yes." "The best you could have at the present time, believe me." "But you say you have watched?" said Valentine uneasily. "Where have you been? I have not seen you." The Count extended his hand towards the library. "I was hidden behind that door," he said, "which leads into the next house which I have rented." Valentine turned her eyes away, and with an indignant expression of pride and modest fear, exclaimed, "Sir, I think you have been guilty of an unparalleled intrusion, and that what you call protection is more like an insult." "Valentine," he answered, "during my long watch over you, all I have observed has been what people visited you, what nourishment was prepared, and what beverage was served. Then, when the latter appeared dangerous to me, I entered, as I have now done, and substituted, in the place of the poison, a healthful draught, which, instead of producing the death intended, caused life to circulate in your veins." "Poison! Death!" exclaimed Valentine, half believing herself under the influence of some feverish hallucination. "What are you saying, sir?" 50071 "Hush, my child," said Monte Cristo, again placing his finger upon her lips. "I did say poison and death, but drink some of this." And the Count took a bottle from his pocket, containing a red liquid, of which he poured a few drops into the glass. "Drink this, and then take nothing more tonight." Valentine stretched out her hand, but scarcely had she touched the glass when she drew back in fear. Monte Cristo took the glass, drank half its contents, and then presented it to Valentine, who smiled and swallowed the rest. "Oh, yes," she exclaimed. "I recognized the flavor of my nocturnal beverage which refreshed me so much, and seemed to ease my aching brain. Thank you, sir. Thank you." "This is how you have lived during the last 4 nights, Valentine," said the Count. "But, oh, how I passed that time! Oh, the wretched hours I have endured! The torture to which I have submitted when I saw the deadly poison poured into your glass, and how I trembled lest you should drink it before I could find time to throw it away." "Sir," said Valentine at the height of her terror, "you say you endured tortures when you saw the deadly poison poured into my glass. But if you saw this, you must also have seen the person who poured it?" "Yes." Valentine raised herself in bed, and drew over her chest, which appeared whiter than snow, the embroidered cambric, still moist with the cold dews of delirium, to which were now added those of terror. "You saw the person?" repeated the young girl. "Yes," repeated the Count. "What you tell me is horrible, sir. You wish to make me believe something too dreadful." "What?" "Attempt to murder me in my father's house, in my room, on my bed of sickness." "Oh, leave me, sir. You are tempting me. You make me doubt the goodness of Providence. It is impossible. It cannot be. Are you the first that this hand has stricken? Have you not seen M. de Saint Méran, Madame de Saint Méran, Barrois, all fall? Would not M. Noirtier also have fallen a victim? Had not the treatment he has been pursuing for the last 3 years neutralized the effects of the poison?" "Oh, heaven!" said Valentine. "Is this the reason why grandpapa has made me share all his beverages during the last month? And have they all tasted of a slightly bitter flavor, like that of dried orange peel? Oh, yes, yes. Then that explains all, said Monte Cristo. Your grandfather knows, then, that a poisoner lives here. Perhaps he even suspects the person. He has been fortifying you, his beloved child, against the fatal effects of the poison, which has failed because your system was already impregnated with it. But even this would have availed little against a more deadly medium of death employed 4 days ago, which is generally but too fatal. But who, then, is this assassin, this murderer? Let me also ask you a question. Have you never seen anyone enter your room at night? Oh, yes. I have frequently seen shadows pass close to me, approach and disappear, but I took them for visions raised by my feverish imagination, and indeed when you entered I thought I was under the influence of delirium. Then you do not know who it is that attempts your life? 50073M. No, said Valentine. Who could desire my death? You shall know it now, then, said Monte Cristo, listening. How do you mean? Said Valentine, looking anxiously around. Because you are not feverish or delirious tonight, but thoroughly awake. Midnight is striking, which is the hour murderers choose. Oh, heavens! Exclaimed Valentine, wiping off the drops which ran down her forehead. Midnight struck slowly and sadly. Every hour seemed to strike with leaden weight upon the heart of the poor girl. Valentine, said the Count, summon up all your courage, still the beatings of your heart. Do not let a sound escape you, and feign to be asleep. Then you will see. Valentine seized the Count's hand. I think I hear a noise, she said. Leave me. Goodbye for the present, replied the Count, walking upon tiptoe towards the library door, and smiling with an expression so sad and paternal that the young girl's heart was filled with gratitude. Before closing the door he turned around once more and said, Not a movement, not a word. Let them think you asleep, or perhaps you may be killed before I have the power of helping you. And with this fearful injunction the Count disappeared through the door, which noiselessly closed after him. Chapter 101. Locusta Valentine was alone. 2 other clocks, slower than that of Saint Philippe du Roule, struck the hour of midnight from different directions, and excepting the rumbling of a few carriages all was silent. Then Valentine's attention was engrossed by the clock in her room, which marked the seconds. She began counting them, remarking that they were much slower than the beatings of her heart. And still she doubted. The inoffensive Valentine could not imagine that anyone should desire her death. Why should they? To what end? What had she done to excite the malice of an enemy? There was no fear of her falling asleep. One terrible idea pressed upon her mind, that someone existed in the world who had attempted to assassinate her, and who was about to endeavor to do so again. Supposing this person, wearied at the inefficacy of the poison, should, as Monte Cristo intimated, have recourse to steel. What if the Count should have no time to run to her rescue? What if her last moments were approaching, and she should never again see Morel? When this terrible chain of ideas presented itself, Valentine was nearly persuaded to ring the bell and call for help. But through the door she fancied she saw the luminous eye of the Count, that eye which lived in her memory, and the recollection overwhelmed her with so much shame that she asked herself whether any amount of gratitude could ever repay his adventurous and devoted friendship. 20 minutes, 20 tedious minutes, passed thus, then 10 more, and at last the clock struck the half-hour. Just then the sound of fingernails slightly grating against the door of the library informed Valentine that the Count was still watching and recommended her to do the same. At the same time, on the opposite side, that is towards Edward's room, Valentine fancied that she heard the creaking of the floor. She listened attentively, holding her breath till she was nearly suffocated. The lock turned and the door slowly opened. Valentine had raised herself upon her elbow, and had scarcely time to throw herself down on the bed and shade her eyes with her arm. Then, trembling, agitated, and her heart beating with indescribable terror, she awaited the event. Someone approached the bed and drew back the curtains. Valentine summoned every effort, and breathed with that regular respiration which announces tranquil sleep. "Valentine," said a low voice. The girl shuddered to the heart but did not reply. "Valentine," repeated the same voice, still silent. Valentine had promised not to wake. Then everything was still, excepting that Valentine heard the almost noiseless sound of some liquid being poured into the glass she had just emptied. Then she ventured to open her eyelids and glance over her extended arm. She saw a woman in a white dressing gown pouring a liquor from a phial into her glass. During this short time Valentine must have held her breath, or moved in some slight degree, for the woman, disturbed, stopped and leaned over the bed, in order the better to ascertain whether Valentine slept. It was Madame de Villefort. On recognizing her stepmother, Valentine could not repress a shudder, which caused a vibration in the bed. Madame de Villefort instantly stepped back close to the wall, and there, shaded by the bed curtains, she silently and attentively watched the slightest movement of Valentine. The latter recollected the terrible caution of Monte Cristo. She fancied that the hand not holding the phial clasped a long, sharp knife. Then, collecting all her remaining strength, she forced herself to close her eyes. But this simple operation upon the most delicate organs of our frame, generally so easy to accomplish, became almost impossible at this moment. So much did curiosity struggle to retain the eyelid open and learn the truth. Madame de Villefort, however, reassured by the silence, which was alone disturbed by the regular breathing of Valentine, again extended her hand, and half hidden by the curtains succeeded in emptying the contents of the phial into the glass. Then she retired so gently that Valentine did not know she had left the room. She only witnessed the withdrawal of the arm, the fair round arm of a woman but 25 years old, and who yet spread death around her. 50077 MIT is impossible to describe the sensations experienced by Valentine during the minute and a half Madame de Villefort remained in the room. The grating against the library door aroused the young girl from the stupor in which she was plunged, and which almost amounted to insensibility. She raised her head with an effort. The noiseless door again turned on its hinges, and the Count of Monte Cristo reappeared. "Well," said he, "do you still doubt?" "Oh," murmured the young girl. "Have you seen? Alas! Did you recognize?" Valentine groaned. "Oh, yes," she said. "I saw, but I cannot believe. Would you rather die, then, and cause Maximilian's death?" "Oh," repeated the young girl, almost bewildered. "Can I not leave the house? Can I not escape?" "Valentine, the hand which now threatens you will pursue you everywhere. Your servants will be seduced with gold, and death will be offered to you disguised in every shape. You will find it in the water you drink from the spring, in the fruit you pluck from the tree. But did you not say that my kind grandfather's precaution had neutralized the poison? Yes, but not against a strong dose. The poison will be changed, and the quantity increased." He took the glass and raised it to his lips. "It is already done," he said. "Brucine is no longer employed, but a simple narcotic. I can recognize the flavor of the alcohol in which it has been dissolved. If you had taken what Madame de Villefort has poured into your glass, Valentine, you would have been doomed." "But," exclaimed the young girl, "why am I thus pursued? Why? Are you so kind, so good, so unsuspicious of ill, that you cannot understand Valentine? No, I have never injured her. But you are rich, Valentine. You have 200,000 livres a year, and you prevent her son from enjoying these 200,000 livres. How so? The fortune is not her gift, but is inherited from my relations." "Certainly, and that is why M. and Madame de Saint-Méran have died. That is why M. Noirtier was sentenced the day he made you his heir. That is why you, in your turn, are to die. It is because your father would inherit your property, and your brother, his only son, succeed to his. Edward? Poor child! Are all these crimes committed on his account? Ah, then you at length understand? Heaven grant that this may not be visited upon him. Valentine, you are an angel. But why is my grandfather allowed to live? It was considered that you dead, the fortune would naturally revert to your brother, unless he were disinherited. And besides, the crime appearing useless, it would be folly to commit it. And is it possible that this frightful combination of crimes has been invented by a woman? Do you recollect in the arbor of the Hotel de Postes at Perugia, seeing a man in a brown cloak, whom your stepmother was questioning upon Aqua Tofana? Well, ever since then, the infernal project has been ripening in her brain. "Ah, then, indeed, sir," said the sweet girl, bathed in tears, "I see that I am condemned to die." "No, Valentine, for I have foreseen all their plots. No, your enemy is conquered since we know her, and you will live, Valentine. Live to be happy yourself and to confer happiness upon a noble heart. But to ensure this you must rely on me. Command me, sir. What am I to do? You must blindly take what I give you. Alas, were it only for my own sake, I should prefer to die. You must not confide in anyone, not even in your father. My father is not engaged in this fearful plot, is he, sir? Asked Valentine, clasping her hands. No, and yet your father, a man accustomed to judicial accusations, ought to have known that all these deaths have not happened naturally. It is he who should have watched over you. He should have occupied my place. He should have emptied that glass. He should have risen against the assassin. Spectre against spectre, he murmured in a low voice as he concluded his sentence. Sir, said Valentine, I will do all I can to live, for there are two beings who love me and will die if I die, my grandfather and Maximilian. I will watch over them as I have over you. Well, sir, do as you will with me. And then she added in a low voice, Oh, heavens, what will befall me? Whatever may happen, Valentine, do not be alarmed. Though you suffer, though you lose sight, hearing, consciousness, fear nothing. Though you should awake and be ignorant where you are, still do not fear. Even though you should find yourself in a sepulchral vault or coffin, reassure yourself, then, and say to yourself, At this moment, a friend, a father, who lives for my happiness and that of Maximilian, watches over me. Alas, alas, what a fearful extremity! Valentine, would you rather denounce your stepmother? I would rather die 100 times. Oh, yes, die! No, you will not die. But will you promise me, whatever happens, that you will not complain, but hope? I will think of Maximilian. You are my own darling child, Valentine. I alone can save you, and I will. Valentine, in the extremity of her terror, joined her hands. For she felt that the moment had arrived to ask for courage, and began to pray, and while uttering little more than incoherent words, she forgot that her white shoulders had no other covering than her long hair, and that the pulsations of her heart could be seen through the lace of her nightdress. Monte Cristo gently laid his hand on the young girl's arm, drew the velvet coverlet close to her throat, and said with a paternal smile, My child, believe in my devotion to you as you believe in the goodness of Providence and the love of Maximilian. Valentine gave him a look full of gratitude, and remained as docile as a child. Then he drew from his waistcoat pocket the little emerald box, raised the golden lid, and took from it a pastille about the size of a pea, which he placed in her hand. She took it and looked attentively on the Count. There was an expression on the face of her intrepid protector which commanded her veneration. She evidently interrogated him by her look. Yes, said he. Valentine carried the pastille to her mouth and swallowed it. And now, my dear child, adieu for the present. I will try and gain a little sleep, for you are saved. Go, said Valentine. Whatever happens, I promise you not to fear. Monte Cristo for some time kept his eyes fixed on the young girl, who gradually fell asleep, yielding to the effects of the narcotic the Count had given her. Then he took the glass, emptied 3 parts of the contents in the fireplace, that it might be supposed Valentine had taken it, and replaced it on the table. Then he disappeared after throwing a farewell glance on Valentine, who slept with the confidence and innocence of an angel at the feet of the Lord. Chapter 102. Valentine, the nightlight continued to burn on the chimney-piece, exhausting the last drops of oil which floated on the surface of the water. The globe of the lamp appeared of a reddish hue, and the flame, brightening before it expired, threw out the last flickerings which in an inanimate object have been so often compared with the convulsions of a human creature in its final agonies. A dull and dismal light was shed over the bedclothes and curtains surrounding the young girl. All noise in the streets had ceased, and the silence was frightful. It was then that the door of Edward's room opened, and a head we have before noticed appeared in the glass opposite. It was Madame de Villefort, who came to witness the effects of the drink she had prepared. She stopped in the doorway, listened for a moment to the flickering of the lamp, the only sound in that deserted room, and then advanced to the table to see if Valentine's glass were empty. It was still about a quarter full, as we before stated. Madame de Villefort emptied the contents into the ashes, which she disturbed that they might the more readily absorb the liquid. Then she carefully rinsed the glass and, wiping it with her handkerchief, replaced it on the table. That if anyone could have looked into the room just then, he would have noticed the hesitation with which Madame de Villefort approached the bed and looked fixedly on Valentine. The dim light, the profound silence, and the gloomy thoughts inspired by the hour, and still more by her own conscience, all combined to produce a sensation of fear. The poisoner was terrified at the contemplation of her own work. At length she rallied, drew aside the curtain, and leaning over the pillow gazed intently on Valentine. The young girl no longer breathed, no breath issued through the half-closed teeth. The white lips no longer quivered, the eyes were suffused with a bluish vapor, and the long black lashes rested on a cheek white as wax. Madame de Villefort gazed upon the face so expressive even in its stillness. Then she ventured to raise the coverlet and press her hand upon the young girl's heart. It was cold and motionless. She only felt the pulsation in her own fingers, and withdrew her hand with a shudder. One arm was hanging out of the bed. From shoulder to elbow it was molded after the arms of Germain Pilon's Graces, 23, but the forearm seemed to be slightly distorted by convulsion, and the hand, so delicately formed, was resting with stiff, outstretched fingers on the framework of the bed. The nails, too, were turning blue. Madame de Villefort had no longer any doubt. All was over. She had consummated the last terrible work she had to accomplish. There was no more to do in the room, so the poisoner retired stealthily, as though fearing to hear the sound of her own footsteps. But as she withdrew she still held aside the curtain, absorbed in the irresistible attraction always exerted by the picture of death. So long as it is merely mysterious and does not excite disgust, the minutes passed. Madame de Villefort could not drop the curtain which she held like a funeral pall over the head of Valentine. She was lost in reverie, and the reverie of crime is remorse. Just then the lamp again flickered. The noise startled Madame de Villefort, who shuddered and dropped the curtain. Immediately afterwards the light expired, and the room was plunged in frightful obscurity, while the clock at that minute struck 4:30. Overpowered with agitation, the poisoner succeeded in groping her way to the door, and reached her room in an agony of fear. The darkness lasted 2 hours longer. Then by degrees a cold light crept through the Venetian blinds, until at length it revealed the objects in the room. About this time the nurse's cough was heard on the stairs, and the woman entered the room with a cup in her hand. To the tender eye of a father or a lover, the first glance would have sufficed to reveal Valentine's condition. But to this hireling, Valentine only appeared to sleep. "Good!" she exclaimed, approaching the table. "She has taken part of her draught. The glass is 3/4 empty." Then she went to the fireplace and lit the fire, and although she had just left her bed, she could not resist the temptation offered by Valentine's sleep, so she threw herself into an armchair to snatch a little more rest. The clock striking 8 awoke her. Astonished at the prolonged slumber of the patient, and frightened to see that the arm was still hanging out of the bed, she advanced towards Valentine, and for the first time noticed the white lips. She tried to replace the arm, but it moved with a frightful rigidity which could not deceive a sick nurse. She screamed aloud, then running to the door exclaimed, "Help! Help! 50083M, what is the matter?" asked M. d'Avrigny at the foot of the stairs, it being the hour he usually visited her. "What is it?" asked Villefort, rushing from his room. "Doctor, do you hear them call for help?" "Yes, yes. Let us hasten up." It was in Valentine's room. But before the doctor and the father could reach the room, the servants who were on the same floor had entered, and seeing Valentine pale and motionless on her bed, they lifted up their hands towards heaven and stood transfixed, as though struck by lightning. "Call Madame de Villefort! Wake Madame de Villefort!" cried the procureur from the door of his chamber, which apparently he scarcely dared to leave. But instead of obeying him, the servants stood watching M. d'Avrigny, who ran to Valentine, and raised her in his arms. "What? This one too?" he exclaimed. "Oh, where will be the end?" Villefort rushed into the room. "What are you saying, doctor?" he exclaimed, raising his hands to heaven. "I say that Valentine is dead," replied d'Avrigny, in a voice terrible in its solemn calmness. 50085 De Villefort staggered and buried his head in the bed. On the exclamation of the doctor and the cry of the father, the servants all fled with muttered imprecations. They were heard running down the stairs and through the long passages. Then there was a rush in the court. Afterwards all was still. They had, one and all, deserted the accursed house. Just then, Madame de Villefort, in the act of slipping on her dressing gown, threw aside the drapery and for a moment stood motionless, as though interrogating the occupants of the room, while she endeavored to call up some rebellious tears. On a sudden she stepped, or rather bounded, with outstretched arms, towards the table. She saw d'Avrigny curiously examining the glass, which she felt certain of having emptied during the night. It was now a third full, just as it was when she threw the contents into the ashes. The spectre of Valentine rising before the poisoner would have alarmed her less. It was, indeed, the same color as the draught she had poured into the glass, and which Valentine had drunk. It was indeed the poison, which could not deceive M. d'Avrigny, which he now examined so closely. It was doubtless a miracle from heaven, that, notwithstanding her precautions, there should be some trace, some proof remaining to reveal the crime, while Madame de Villefort remained rooted to the spot like a statue of terror, and Villefort, with his head hidden in the bedclothes, saw nothing. Around him, d'Avrigny approached the window, that he might the better examine the contents of the glass, and dipping the tip of his finger in, tasted it. "Ah!" he exclaimed. "It is no longer brucine that is used. Let me see what it is." Then he ran to one of the cupboards in Valentine's room, which had been transformed into a medicine closet, and taking from its silver case a small bottle of nitric acid, dropped a little of it into the liquor, which immediately changed to a blood-red color. "Ah!" exclaimed d'Avrigny, in a voice in which the horror of a judge unveiling the truth was mingled with the delight of a student making a discovery. Madame de Villefort was overpowered. Her eyes first flashed and then swam. She staggered towards the door and disappeared. Directly afterwards the distant sound of a heavy weight falling on the ground was heard, but no one paid any attention to it. The nurse was engaged in watching the chemical analysis, and Villefort was still absorbed in grief. M. d'Avrigny alone had followed Madame de Villefort with his eyes, and watched her hurried retreat. He lifted up the drapery over the entrance to Edward's room, and his eye reaching as far as Madame de Villefort's apartment, he beheld her extended lifeless on the floor. "Go to the assistance of Madame de Villefort," he said to the nurse. "Madame de Villefort is ill. 50087 But Mademoiselle de Villefort," stammered the nurse. "Mademoiselle de Villefort no longer requires help," said d'Avrigny, "since she is dead." "Dead? Dead?" groaned forth Villefort, in a paroxysm of grief, which was the more terrible from the novelty of the sensation in the iron heart of that man. "Dead?" repeated a third voice. "Who said Valentine was dead?" The two men turned round, and saw Morel standing at the door, pale and terror-stricken. Chapter 102. Valentine. The nightlight continued to burn on the chimney-piece, exhausting the last drops of oil which floated on the surface of the water. The globe of the lamp appeared of a reddish hue, and the flame, brightening before it expired, threw out the last flickerings which in an inanimate object have been so often compared with the convulsions of a human creature in its final agonies. A dull and dismal light was shed over the bedclothes and curtains surrounding the young girl. All noise in the streets had ceased, and the silence was frightful. It was then that the door of Edward's room opened, and a head we have before noticed appeared in the glass opposite. It was Madame de Villefort, who came to witness the effects of the drink she had prepared. She stopped in the doorway, listened for a moment to the flickering of the lamp, the only sound in that deserted room, and then advanced to the table to see if Valentine's glass were empty. It was still about a quarter full, as we before stated. Madame de Villefort emptied the contents into the ashes, which she disturbed that they might the more readily absorb the liquid. Then she carefully rinsed the glass, and wiping it with her handkerchief replaced it on the table. If anyone could have looked into the room just then, he would have noticed the hesitation with which Madame de Villefort approached the bed and looked fixedly on Valentine. The dim light, the profound silence, and the gloomy thoughts inspired by the hour, and still more by her own conscience, all combined to produce a sensation of fear. The poisoner was terrified at the contemplation of her own work. At length she rallied, drew aside the curtain, and leaning over the pillow gazed intently on Valentine. The young girl no longer breathed, no breath issued through the half-closed teeth. The white lips no longer quivered, the eyes were suffused with a bluish vapor, and the long black lashes rested on a cheek white as wax. Madame de Villefort gazed upon the face so expressive even in its stillness. Then she ventured to raise the coverlet and press her hand upon the young girl's heart. It was cold and motionless. She only felt the pulsation in her own fingers and withdrew her hand with a shudder. One arm was hanging out of the bed. From shoulder to elbow it was molded after the arms of Germain Pilon's Graces, 23, but the forearm seemed to be slightly distorted by convulsion, and the hand, so delicately formed, was resting with stiff, outstretched fingers on the framework of the bed. The nails, too, were turning blue. Madame de Villefort had no longer any doubt. All was over. She had consummated the last terrible work she had to accomplish. There was no more to do in the room, so the poisoner retired stealthily, as though fearing to hear the sound of her own footsteps. But as she withdrew, she still held aside the curtain, absorbed in the irresistible attraction always exerted by the picture of death. So long as it is merely mysterious and does not excite disgust, the minutes passed. Madame de Villefort could not drop the curtain which she held like a funeral pall over the head of Valentine. She was lost in reverie, and the reverie of crime is remorse. Just then the lamp again flickered. The noise startled Madame de Villefort, who shuddered and dropped the curtain. Immediately afterwards the light expired, and the room was plunged in frightful obscurity, while the clock at that minute struck 4:30, overpowered with agitation. The poisoner succeeded in groping her way to the door, and reached her room in an agony of fear. The darkness lasted 2 hours longer. Then by degrees a cold light crept through the Venetian blinds, until at length it revealed the objects in the room. About this time the nurse's cough was heard on the stairs, and the woman entered the room with a cup in her hand. To the tender eye of a father or a lover, the first glance would have sufficed to reveal Valentine's condition. But to this hireling, Valentine only appeared to sleep. "Good!" she exclaimed, approaching the table. "She has taken part of her draught. The glass is 3/4 empty." Then she went to the fireplace and lit the fire, and although she had just left her bed, she could not resist the temptation offered by Valentine's sleep, so she threw herself into an armchair to snatch a little more rest. The clock striking 8 awoke her. Astonished at the prolonged slumber of the patient, and frightened to see that the arm was still hanging out of the bed, she advanced towards Valentine, and for the first time noticed the white lips. She tried to replace the arm, but it moved with a frightful rigidity which could not deceive a sick nurse. She screamed aloud, then running to the door exclaimed, "Help! Help! 50083M, what is the matter?" asked him D'Avrigny at the foot of the stairs, it being the hour he usually visited her. "What is it?" asked Villefort, rushing from his room. "Doctor, do you hear them call for help?" "Yes, yes. Let us hasten up." It was in Valentine's room. But before the doctor and the father could reach the room, the servants who were on the same floor had entered, and seeing Valentine pale and motionless on her bed, they lifted up their hands towards heaven and stood transfixed, as though struck by lightning. "Call Madame de Villefort! Wake Madame de Villefort!" cried the procureur from the door of his chamber, which apparently he scarcely dared to leave. But instead of obeying him, the servants stood watching him, D'Avrigny, who ran to Valentine, and raised her in his arms. "What? This one too?" he exclaimed. "Oh, where will be the end?" Villefort rushed into the room. "What are you saying, doctor?" he exclaimed, raising his hands to heaven. "I say that Valentine is dead," replied D'Avrigny, in a voice terrible in its solemn calmness. 50085 De Villefort staggered and buried his head in the bed. On the exclamation of the doctor and the cry of the father, the servants all fled with muttered imprecations. They were heard running down the stairs and through the long passages. Then there was a rush in the court. Afterwards all was still. They had, one and all, deserted the accursed house. Just then Madame de Villefort, in the act of slipping on her dressing gown, threw aside the drapery and for a moment stood motionless, as though interrogating the occupants of the room, while she endeavored to call up some rebellious tears. On a sudden she stepped, or rather bounded, with outstretched arms, towards the table. She saw D'Avrigny curiously examining the glass, which she felt certain of having emptied during the night. It was now a third full, just as it was when she threw the contents into the ashes. The spectre of Valentine rising before the poisoner would have alarmed her less. It was, indeed, the same color as the draught she had poured into the glass, and which Valentine had drunk. It was indeed the poison, which could not deceive him, D'Avrigny, which he now examined so closely. It was doubtless a miracle from heaven, that, notwithstanding her precautions, There should be some trace, some proof remaining to reveal the crime, while Madame de Villefort remained rooted to the spot like a statue of terror, and Villefort, with his head hidden in the bedclothes, saw nothing. Around him, D'Avrigny approached the window, that he might the better examine the contents of the glass, and dipping the tip of his finger in, tasted it. "Ah!" he exclaimed. "It is no longer brucine that is used. Let me see what it is." Then he ran to one of the cupboards in Valentine's room, which had been transformed into a medicine closet, and taking from its silver case a small bottle of nitric acid, dropped a little of it into the liquor, which immediately changed to a blood-red color. "Ah!" exclaimed D'Avrigny, in a voice in which the horror of a judge unveiling the truth was mingled with the delight of a student making a discovery. Madame de Villefort was overpowered. Her eyes first flashed and then swam. She staggered towards the door and disappeared. Directly afterwards, the distant sound of a heavy weight falling on the ground was heard, but no one paid any attention to it. The nurse was engaged in watching the chemical analysis, and Villefort was still absorbed in grief. D'Avrigny alone had followed Madame de Villefort with his eyes, and watched her hurried retreat. He lifted up the drapery over the entrance to Edward's room, and his eye reaching as far as Madame de Villefort's apartment, he beheld her extended lifeless on the floor. "Go to the assistance of Madame de Villefort," he said to the nurse. "Madame de Villefort is ill. 50087 But Mademoiselle de Villefort," stammered the nurse. "Mademoiselle de Villefort no longer requires help," said D'Avrigny, "since she is dead." "Dead? Dead?" groaned forth Villefort, in a paroxysm of grief, which was the more terrible from the novelty of the sensation in the iron heart of that man. "Dead?" repeated a third voice. "Who said Valentine was dead?" The two men turned round, and saw Morel standing at the door, pale and terror-stricken.